She was worth $3 billion. He made 12 an hour plus tips. And in front of every powerful investor she had spent months trying to impress, she pointed at him and said, "Not him. Get me someone else." What Sloane Carrington didn't know was that the man she just humiliated in front of a room full of strangers was the only reason those investors still showed up to her dinners at all. She was about to find that out the hard way. If you're new here, hit subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare leave before this story is over. The dinner reservation had been made 6 weeks in advance. That was the first thing Marcus Chen noticed when he pulled up the booking on the restaurant's internal system. 6 weeks, which in the world of fine dining meant someone was either celebrating something enormous or trying very hard to make something happen. At the Belmont, those two things were often the same. Marcus managed the front of house on Friday evenings. Yes, he'd intervened, which meant he was responsible for everything that happened between the moment a guest stepped through the heavy oak doors and the moment they left with either a satisfied smile or a complaint that would find its way onto a review site by midnight. He had been doing this job for 11 years. He was very good at it. He took it seriously in the way that only people who understood what it cost to build a reputation took anything seriously. He assigned Caleb to table 7 at 4:15 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the first guest was expected to arrive. Wasn't a difficult decision. Table 7 was the private dining room, a separate space tucked behind the main floor, accessible through a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of the restaurant's history. It seated 12 comfortably. It had its own ventilation system, its own lighting controls, and walls thick enough that conversations conducted inside it rarely carried through to the main floor. Corporate clients used it for sensitive meetings. Couples used it for proposals. Occasionally, someone used it to deliver news that couldn't be delivered anywhere else. For tonight, a technology executive named Sloane Carrington had reserved the full room for what Marcus's notes described as a business and potential partnership discussion. Multiple guests, dietary restrictions to be confirmed upon arrival. He had assigned Caleb because Caleb was the best server he had. That wasn't sentiment. Marcus Chen did not deal in sentiment when it came to table assignments. Caleb Mercer had been working at the Belmont for 4 years, and in that time he had handled a state senator's surprise announcement that he was not, in fact, eating alone that evening. He had managed a dinner that ended in a marriage proposal, and also, unfortunately, a loud refusal. He had once quietly relocated 3 courses worth of food from a table when a guest quietly informed him, between the appetizer and the entree, that she had just learned her husband intended to file for divorce, and she could not sit facing the door anymore. Caleb handled things. He didn't make them worse. In a business where the difference between those two outcomes often came down to a single moment and a single person, that was worth more than Marcus could put into a performance review. At 5:40, Caleb arrived for his shift. He came in through the service entrance, the way staff always did, nodding at the prep cooks, who were finishing the last of the mise en place for the evening rush. He was a tall man, not dramatically so, but tall enough that he moved through the narrow kitchen corridors with a particular kind of careful awareness, the awareness of someone who had learned early that his body took up more space than he intended. He wore his uniform the way he wore most things, neatly, without fuss, the white dress shirt pressed, the black apron tied straight. He checked the assignment board, saw his name beside table 7, walked to the private room to inspect the setup. The table had already been laid by the afternoon prep staff, but Caleb went through it anyway. He aligned the silverware. He checked the water glasses for spots. He looked at the floral arrangement the event coordinator had placed at the center of the table and quietly moved it 4 inches to the left, because it had been positioned in a way that would require guests seated directly across from each other to lean sideways to make eye contact, which was not something you wanted at a business dinner where eye contact was basically a currency. Then he pulled out his small notebook, a habit he'd kept since his first year, and reviewed the reservation notes Marcus had left. Carrington party. 12 guests anticipated, possibly 11. Dietary, confirm on arrival. No specific requests noted. C. Carrington, CEO, Carrington Technologies. He wrote a few things down, checked the wine list against what they had in stock, made a mental note to confirm with the kitchen about the evening's vegetarian option, because in his experience, business dinners always had at least two people who were vegetarian and had forgotten to mention it. At 6:10, he went back to the main floor and began setting up his secondary tables for the evening. He had 3 others assigned alongside table 7, a smaller workload than usual, because most marketers that table 7 would require his full attention once the dinner began. At 6:45, a black car pulled up outside the Belmont's entrance. Caleb was refilling a water glass at table 4 when he heard the shift in energy near the front door, not loud, nothing dramatic, just the subtle change in posture that moves through a room when someone arrives who other people are aware of. He didn't turn immediately. He finished with the water glass. He set the pitcher down properly. Then he looked up. Sloane Carrington walked into the Belmont, the way people walked into rooms when they had trained themselves never to look uncertain. She was 30 years old, which most people guessed wrong because she carried herself with a particular kind of stillness that read as older. She was not a tall woman, 5'4", maybe 5'5", but she occupied space efficiently, the way small objects with significant mass tend to do. Her coat was charcoal gray and clearly expensive in the way that very expensive things often are, which is to say it didn't announce itself. Her hair was dark, pulled back from her face in a way that suggested she had done it herself in a car on the way over, and it had somehow turned out perfectly, which was the kind of outcome that happened to people who didn't waste energy worrying about things like hair. She scanned the restaurant once. Her eyes found Marcus at the host stand. She moved toward him without hesitation. "Carrington," she said. "Private dining." "Of course, Miss Carrington." Marcus smiled the particular smile he reserved for guests who had not yet smiled at him. "We have everything prepared. Can I offer you something while you're guests?" "I'll go to the room." Marcus walked her back. Caleb was in the private dining room when they entered, making a final check on the table. He turned as the door opened, offered the standard greeting he had given 1,000 times, a small nod, direct eye contact, a brief, "Good evening. I'm Caleb. I'll be taking care of you and your guests this evening." Sloane Carrington looked at him. Not the long, considering look of someone trying to read a person. The brief, dismissive look of someone deciding very quickly that what they were looking at did not require further consideration. She turned to Marcus. "I'd like someone else." Marcus kept his expression even. He had been doing this long enough that almost nothing showed on his face when he didn't want it to. "I'm sorry, for the table." She set her bag on the chair at the head of the table, her chair, apparently a decision she had made without consulting anyone. "I'd like a different server. Someone more." She paused, and whatever word she had been about to use, she seemed to decide against it. "Someone with more experience handling this type of evening." Caleb stood 2 feet away from this conversation. He did not move. He kept his face neutral in the practiced way that people who have been dismissed in professional settings learn to keep things neutral, not because it doesn't sting, but because the alternative is giving someone the satisfaction of seeing that it does. "Caleb is our most experienced server for private events," Marcus said carefully. He was walking a line that Marcus walked often between advocating for his staff and not creating a confrontation that a guest would then carry into a review or a complaint to ownership. "He's handled." "I'm sure he's very capable," Sloane said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite and aren't particularly concerned about hiding it. "I'd still prefer someone else. It's a significant evening." A beat of silence. Caleb spoke before Marcus could. "A problem," he said. His voice was even. Not cold, not wounded, not performing dignity, just even. The way a person sounds when they have decided that the only response available to them is the one that doesn't make things worse. "I hope the evening goes well." He walked out of the private dining room. The hallway was narrow, and the kitchen noise from the main floor filtered back through the walls. And Caleb stood in that hallway for approximately 4 seconds, doing nothing except breathing. Then he went back to work. He picked up his section on the main floor, checked in with the 2 top at table 11, who had been waiting longer than they should have, refilled the bread basket at table 9, and put Sloane Carrington's dinner in the back of his mind where it didn't affect his performance. He was good at that. He had a lot of practice. The reason Caleb Mercer was good at not letting things derail him had a name. The name was Sophie, and she was 8 years old, and she was at her babysitter's house Right now, eating macaroni and cheese and watching whatever animated film she had talked the babysitter into playing, and she expected her father to pick her up by 11. Sophie had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that kept Caleb on his toes on the best days and completely exhausted on the rest. She was in third grade at Millbrook Elementary. She liked dinosaurs with an intensity that bordered on academic. She could tell you the difference between a sauropod and a theropod, and she would absolutely correct you if you got it wrong. Yes, she had recently decided that she wanted to be a paleontologist, which she had announced at the dinner table one Thursday evening with the confidence of someone who had already settled the question. Caleb had said, "Then, we should probably find you some books about bones." Sophie had said, "I already found 3. They're on the library app. Can you check them out?" That was Sophie. He had been raising her alone for 4 years since she was 4, since the accident on Route 9 that had rearranged the landscape of his life in ways he was still 4 years later mapping. He didn't talk about it much. He didn't talk about much in general when it came to the hard things. He talked to Sophie about the things she needed to know in the language of an 8-year-old, which meant he talked about what happened in simple, honest terms, and then he made sure she had what she needed, and he kept moving. He had been keeping moving for 4 years. The job at the Belmont was the best one he had found. The hours were brutal. Friday and Saturday nights ran until close, which meant sometimes midnight, sometimes later, but the pay was the best in the city for someone without a college degree. And Marcus Chen ran a clean operation, which meant Caleb wasn't spending energy managing chaos that came from bad management. He could focus on the work. He was good at the work. Work, most nights, was enough. By 7:30, the private dining room was full. Caleb knew this because he passed the hallway twice and heard the particular sound of a room operating at capacity, overlapping voices, the occasional burst of laughter, the specific clink of ice against glass that meant people were settling in. He had been replaced at that table by David, who was 24 and enthusiastic and had been at the Belmont for 8 months and was technically competent in the way that a person who was still figuring out what excellent actually looked like could be technically competent. He did not think about David with resentment. He thought about David with mild professional concern because a table of 12 high-level executives on a significant business evening was not, in his assessment, an ideal assignment for someone with 8 months of experience, and he hoped Marcus had briefed him thoroughly. Then he stopped thinking about it, because it wasn't his table, and Table 11 had just requested the dessert menu. At 7:50, the change happened. It didn't announce itself. It started as a change in foot traffic near the private dining room hallway, a server coming out with a confused expression. Then Marcus walking briskly in the direction of that hallway. Marquis looking. Then Marcus walking back in, the way Marcus sometimes looked when something had happened that was going to require him to solve a problem he hadn't anticipated. He found Caleb at table 6. "I need a minute," Marcus said quietly. Caleb excused himself, followed Marcus to the edge of the floor where the noise of the restaurant gave them a layer of cover. "The guests in table 7, Marcus said. "Several of them are asking for you." Caleb looked at him. Specifically, Marcus continued, keeping his voice low, "Mr. Harrington, do you know who he is?" He told David that he'd been hoping you were going to be their server this evening, and asked what had happened. Mr. Voss apparently said something similar. Now it sounds like Ms. Carrington is getting some questions she wasn't expecting. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how bad is it? No yet. It could be nothing. But Mr. Harrington closed his folder. Marcus paused. Doesn't close his folder unless he's decided something. The name James Harrington was known to anyone who had worked in Westbridge's business community longer than 6 months. 63 years old, had built 3 companies from nothing, and had a reputation for judging people in the first 3 minutes of any interaction with a precision that made most MBAs feel like amateurs. He had been coming to the Belmont for 7 years. He had specifically requested Caleb's section the last 4 times he had dined here. "What do you want me to do?" Caleb asked. Marcus looked at him steadily. "Yet give it a few minutes. If it escalates..." "Marcus, I know. She asked you to pull me off her table." "She did. Then I'm not walking back in there unless she asks." Marcus nodded. He understood. "Give it a few minutes," he said again. and then he went back toward the private dining room. What Caleb didn't see, because he wasn't in the room, was this: James Harrington had noticed the unfamiliar server within approximately 90 seconds of the evening beginning. He hadn't said anything. Immediately, he wasn't the kind of man who announced his observations the moment he made them, but he had noticed, and he had filed it away, and he had watched the table's dynamic with the quiet attention of someone who had spent 40 years reading rooms for a living. When he finally asked David what had happened to Caleb, he asked it the way he asked most things, just without ceremony, in a tone that made it clear he expected a real answer. David, to his credit, answered honestly. He said there had been a staffing reassignment. He said he wasn't entirely sure of the details, which was more or less a confirmation that something had happened, rather than less. Richard Voss, who was sitting 2 seats to Harrington's left, and who ran a private equity firm that had been in conversation with Carrington Technologies for the better part of 6 months, had been listening. He set down his wine glass. "Was there an issue?" he asked David. "Issue that I'm aware of, sir." Voss looked at Harrington. Harrington looked at Voss. Yet neither of them said anything, but something passed between them that had the quality of a decision being made without words. Sloane Carrington was at the head of the table, walking her guests through the preliminary points of the partnership proposal. She was good at this. She had given versions of this presentation to rooms full of skeptical people for the better part of 3 years, and she knew which numbers landed and which stories to tell around them. She had the room's attention, and then she didn't. It was Margaret O.C. who finally broke the surface of it. Margaret was 57, ran a venture capital fund that had made 3 of its partners very wealthy, and had a quality that Sloane had always privately admired. She said the thing that everyone else was thinking but deciding whether to say. "Sloane," Margaret said, during a pause between slides. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it had a directness to it that cut through the ambient sounds of the room. "Did you ask to have Caleb removed from our table?" Silence. Sloane looked at her. "I made a staffing request." "Yes." "Why?" Another pause, slightly longer. "I wanted someone with experience appropriate for this type of event." Margaret looked at her, without expression, for a moment. "Caleb has served this table at 4 of the last 6 dinners I've attended here," she said. "He remembered, without being told, that I cannot have shellfish. He once handled a situation where a colleague received a very distressing phone call during dinner and spent 45 minutes managing the table in a way that allowed her to step away without anyone making her feel worse than she already did." Margaret picked up her wine glass. "Specifically led you to believe he lacked experience." The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone has stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Sloane said it was a judgment call. Harrington cleared his throat. It was the kind of throat clearing that is not about a throat. "What was it based on?" he asked. And Sloane Carrington, who had been in rooms full of difficult questions before and had always known exactly what to say, did not immediately have an answer. She sent for Caleb herself. Non quitte, not through Marcus, she came to the edge of the private dining room hallway and asked the first staff member she saw to please find the server named Caleb and let him know that she would like to speak with him. Caleb was informed by a 20-year-old hostess named Bree, who delivered the message with a slightly wide-eyed expression that suggested she understood the general shape of what was happening without knowing all the details. He finished plating the dessert order for Table 9 before he responded to it. Not to make a point, because Table 9's dessert order had been waiting 4 minutes and he had a responsibility to that table. When he walked toward the private dining room, he did not walk fast or slow. He did not adjust his expression into something theatrical. He was tired at nearly 8, and he'd been on his feet for 2 hours, and he probably looked it, which was fine because he was. He stopped at the hallway entrance. Sloane Carrington was standing there, not quite blocking the way, in the posture of someone who has recently had to make a decision they were not fully comfortable. She looked, for the first time since she had walked through the Belmont's front door, like she was not entirely certain what was going to happen next. She started. "Miss Carrington," Caleb said. His voice was the same as it had been when he introduced himself 90 minutes ago. Direct, not performing anything. "Do you need me to take the table?" She looked at him. There was something working behind her eyes that was more complicated than the simple transaction of a business request. She said. Okay, Caleb said, and he walked past her into the room. The first thing he did was take a quiet inventory. Water levels at seats 3, 7, and 9 low. The breadbasket at the near end of the table was nearly empty. The gentleman at seat 4, Richard Voss, Caleb recognized him without needing to look at a list, had a wine glass that had been placed incorrectly, and was sitting too close to his right elbow, which was a liability waiting to become an accident. He moved the glass. He refilled the water glasses. He caught the eye of the kitchen runner and signaled for bread. He did all of this without announcing himself, without delivering a speech about his return, without making the moment about the moment. He just began doing the job. The temperature of the room changed. Caleb would not have been able to explain this scientifically, because it wasn't science. It was the specific thing that happens when a room full of people who have been tense about something feel, collectively, that the something has been resolved. Shoulders came down slightly. Voices adjusted. The conversation that had stalled while Sloane was out of the room began again, more easily. James Harrington, when Caleb paused near his end of the table to check on the gentleman next to him, looked up and said quietly, "Good to have you back." Caleb said, "Good evening, Mr. Harrington," and moved on. He did not make eye contact with Sloane for the first 15 minutes. Deliberately, he was simply working, and her chair was at the head of the table, and his traffic pattern through the room did not require him to pass directly by her. He's aware of her. He was aware the way you are aware of something that happened earlier, in the evening, that you have not yet fully processed. At 8:20, a problem surfaced. One of Sloane's guests, a younger man, mid-30s, who had arrived late, and whose name Caleb didn't have had a reaction to something. Severe, not anaphylactic, but visible. His face had gone slightly flushed, and he was working to keep his expression neutral, while clearly feeling worse than he wanted to let on, in a room full of people he was trying to impress. Caleb noticed because he noticed things. It was his job to notice things. He went to the kitchen. He came back with water and a small plate of plain crackers, and set them down near the man without commentary. In the motion by which he was clearing a dish from the same area so smooth that it looked like standard service, not intervention. The man looked up at him. Caleb said very quietly, "There's ginger ale available if that would help. I can also speak to the kitchen about the dish if you'd like to know what was in it." The man exhaled, said, "Ginger ale, please." And yes, the dish. Caleb handled it. He found out from the kitchen that the sauce on the salmon had contained a small amount of a spice. The man's companion later confirmed. He was sensitive to not a formal allergy, a sensitivity that the kitchen could have accommodated had they known. Caleb brought the ginger ale, spoke briefly to the kitchen about an alternative, and within 12 minutes, the man had a replacement dish and was no longer looking like was deciding whether he needed to leave. He did this without stopping the table's conversation, without drawing attention to the situation, without making the young man feel embarrassed in a room where he had clearly not wanted to appear vulnerable. It was, to anyone watching closely, extraordinary. Richard Voss was watching closely. Later in the evening after the main course, during the natural pause that happens at a dinner table when people are waiting for dessert and the pressure of the formal agenda has lifted slightly, Voss set down his coffee cup and said, the way men of his age and his business experience sometimes said things, which was to say he said it like he was talking to the room, but meant it for the specific person he was looking at. 6 months ago, I left a folder in this restaurant. Sloane looked up from the notes on her phone. I didn't realize until I was in a car halfway across the city, Voss continued. The folder contained, well, it doesn't matter specifically what it contained. Information that I would not have wanted circulating. He paused. By the time I got back to the restaurant, Caleb had found it, put it in the manager's office himself, and left a note with Marcus identifying exactly which table it had come from and what it looked like, so I could verify it was the right folder. He picked up his coffee cup again. He hadn't opened it. I can't prove that, of course, but the documents were in exactly the sequence I had left them, which, if you've ever had someone go through your papers, you know is very difficult to replicate. He looked at Sloane. He didn't have to do any of that. He could have left it at the host's stand. He could have handed it to a runner. He went out of his way to ensure it was handled securely. And he never mentioned it to me afterward. I only know the details because Marcus told me. Silence at the table. Caleb was near the service station at the far end of the room. He had heard. He kept his face still and continued doing what he was doing, which was checking the dessert order that was about to come out. That's the kind of person, Voss said without raising his voice, that I want in the room during my business dealings, because of what he does for a living, because of what he does when nobody's looking. Sloane did not speak for a long moment. She set her phone face down on the table. It was a small gesture. Everyone in the room saw it, and everyone understood what it meant, that whatever she had been half attending to had just become less important than what was in front of her. Teened. She looked down the length of the table at Caleb, who was still working. He looked back at her, briefly, without expression. And for the first time that evening, Sloane Carrington looked at him, not at his uniform, not at his apron, not at the name tag that said Caleb in simple black letters, but at the actual man standing in the actual room. And something in her face shifted in the way things shift when a person realizes they have made an error of a particular kind, the small kind, the kind that holds up a mirror. It was a person who prided herself on being perceptive, on reading people accurately, on building a company that valued the right things. And she had looked at this man and seen nothing worth seeing in under 3 seconds before he had said a single word. The investors around her table had known him for years, had trusted him with their discomfort and their carelessness and their confidential documents in their difficult evenings. And she, who was supposed to be the sharpest person in any room she walked into, had dismissed him because of a uniform. The presentation she had been giving suddenly felt very far away. The dessert came out at 9:40. Caleb served it the way he served everything, without ceremony, without performance, efficiently, and with care. He remembered, without consulting any notes, that Margaret Osei had mentioned earlier she didn't want the chocolate mousse. He remembered that the man at seat 11 had asked earlier, almost as an aside, whether the tart was very sweet or just slightly sweet. He brought the right things to the right people. When everything was in front of everyone and the room had gone quiet in the comfortable way that happens over dessert, Harrington leaned back in his chair and said, "Sloane." She looked at him. "This is a good proposal," he said. He was looking at her with the particular kind of directness that he had, which was the directness of a man who had stopped wasting words some years ago. "You've done the work." She nodded. "But I want to tell you something," he said. "That isn't about the proposal." Sloane waited. "The people in this room," Harrington said, "have been watching how you handle things for longer than tonight. Just you, everyone. It's how we make decisions. Just about numbers." He paused. "The question we're always actually asking is, what kind of person is this, when they think the stakes are something else?" He didn't look at Caleb when he said it. He didn't need to. Sloane understood what he meant. She understood it completely, sitting at the head of a table she had reserved 6 weeks ago for the most important dinner of her professional year, holding dessert she hadn't touched yet. She had thought she was being evaluated on her numbers and her strategy and her vision. She had been evaluated on how she treated a man she assumed didn't matter, outside through the thick walls of the private dining room. The rest of the Belmont went about its Friday evening. Tables turned over, the bar filled up. The kitchen moved through its rhythm of fire and noise and careful speed. And in the private room, a woman who had spent a decade building something sat very still, inseparable with the decision in front of her that no amount of money or preparation had prepared her to make quickly. Caleb stood near the wall doing his job. The evening wasn't over yet. The dessert plates were still on the table when Sloane finally spoke. She didn't clear her throat first. She didn't shuffle papers or pull up a slide or do any of the things she normally did to signal that she was about to say something important. Yes, he'd intervened. She just set down her fork, which had been resting against the edge of her plate for the past several minutes without being used, and said, "I owe someone in this room an apology." But he moved. The private dining room had a particular kind of silence. When it went quiet, the walls absorbed sound in a way that made stillness feel complete rather than empty. Caleb was near the service station at the far end of the room, and he heard her, but he kept his hands where they were, resting lightly on the edge of the counter, and he waited. "Caleb Sloane," said he. Looked up. She was looking directly at him. At the table, not at the wall beside him. Not at a point somewhere between the two, the way people look when they're addressing someone they can't quite make themselves see. At him. "I asked to have you removed from this table tonight," she said, "before you had done a single thing to warrant it. Before I knew anything about you." She paused. "That was wrong. I want to say that in front of the people who were here to see it happen." The room was still holding its breath. Caleb looked at her for a moment. He wasn't sure what he had expected some version of this. Maybe, after the direction the evening had taken. But expectation and the actual thing are different experiences, and the actual thing was that a woman who had publicly decided he wasn't good enough was now publicly saying the opposite. And he was standing in his work uniform in a room full of people who ran companies and managed fortunes, and he was tired and had about 90 minutes before he needed to pick up Sophie. "I appreciate that," he said. "It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was the honest response of a man who was still deciding what he thought about the moment, and he wasn't going to perform a reaction he hadn't actually arrived at yet." Sloane seemed to understand this. She didn't smile with relief or look around the table to see how the apology had landed. She just nodded once and looked back down at the table. James Harrington picked up his coffee, took a drink, set it back down. "Well," he said, in the tone of a man who had watched things go sideways and then right themselves often enough to know what the appropriate response was, which was to continue. "Where were we?" It wasn't a question. Sloane pulled her laptop closer, and then she seemed to think better of it. She pushed it slightly to the side, not closing it, but not opening it either, and looked at the people around her table the way she rarely let herself look at people in professional settings, which was to say openly, without the polished layer she usually maintained between herself and rooms full of people she needed something from. "The proposal is in your materials," she said. "You've all read it, or you wouldn't be here. I'm not going to walk through it slide by slide." She folded her hands on the table. "I'd rather talk about what actually matters to each of you, and what you need to know from me that isn't in the document." A beat. Then Richard Voss said, "That's a better meeting." And just like that, the evening pivoted. What followed, for the next hour and 20 minutes, was the kind of conversation that business dinners rarely produce but always pretend to be aiming for the actual one, where people say the real things instead of the strategic versions of the real things. Harrington asked pointed questions about the company's operational infrastructure and didn't accept the first answer to any of them. Margaret Osei pressed Sloane on talent retention at the mid-level, which was a question Sloane didn't have a clean answer to, and said so, which Margaret seemed to respect more than a clean answer would have earned. A man named David Park, who had barely spoken before the dessert course, turned out to have detailed concerns about the timeline for integration that took 25 minutes to work through and emerged. Yes, he'd intervened on the other side of those 25 minutes, as a timeline that was actually better than what Sloane had arrived with. Caleb moved through all of this. He refilled. He cleared. He stayed close enough to be immediately useful and far enough away to be invisible, which is the fundamental skill of the job, the art of being present without being felt as a presence. At one point, around 10:15, Margaret Osei held out her coffee cup without looking up from the document she was reading, and Caleb filled it, and she said, still not looking up, "Thank you." Caleb, in the automatic way of someone whose body has registered being taken care of before her mind has caught up. Then she did look up briefly. "Are you doing all right this evening?" It was a strange question in context. Or maybe it wasn't. Margaret Osei had a reputation for treating the question of how people were doing as genuinely worth asking. "I'm good," Caleb said. "Thank you. You handled tonight with a lot of grace," she said. Matter of fact, not effusive. Then she went back to her document. Caleb went back to his work. He thought about Grace on the walk to refill the water pitcher. He wasn't sure grace was the word for what he'd done. He'd done what he always did, which was decide that the alternative to handling something with dignity was handling it without dignity, and the second option never actually made anything better. He'd learned that the hard way, in a different context, in a harder year. He wasn't going to claim it was grace. It was mostly just math. At 10:40, the dinner wrapped. Not with a dramatic announcement. Dinners like this one never ended dramatically. They wound down, guests checking phones with increasing frequency, the energy shifting from focused to satiated to tired. Harrington was the first to stand, which in the hierarchy of the room meant everyone else were permitted to stand. There was a round of handshakes, the exchange of business cards between people who definitely already had each other's information, but did it anyway as a ritual closing gesture. Caleb began clearing the table. Sloane stayed seated as her guests filed out. She was looking at her hands, or possibly at the tablecloth, and she had the expression of someone who had come through something and wasn't entirely sure yet what to do with being on the other side of it. Marcus appeared in the doorway, as he did at the end of every private event, to oversee the closeout. He caught Caleb's eye across the room, and there was a brief moment of eye contact between them that communicated several things without any of them being said. As if the guests had filtered out into the main restaurant, and from there toward the entrance, coats being retrieved, cars being called. David Park stopped in the hallway briefly to speak to a colleague on his phone. Margaret Osei had paused near the host stand to look at something on her tablet. Richard Voss, on his way through the door, stopped beside Caleb. Caleb was stacking plates, and he looked up. Voss was a compact man in his mid-60s, the kind of person whose presence was larger than his physical stature, because he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had not needed to perform authority in a very long time. He looked at Caleb for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how directly to say something. "That folder," Voss said. Caleb said, "Sir, you could have looked." Most people would have. Caleb thought about how to answer that. He settled on, "It wasn't mine to look at." Voss studied him. "That's a short answer." "It's the whole answer," Caleb said. Something shifted in Voss's expression. Not surprise, exactly, more like confirmation. He nodded, reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, which he set on the cleared edge of the table beside Caleb's stacked plates. "That's my direct line," Voss said. "Not my office." "My line," he paused. "There's a hospitality management division within my portfolio that has been without a decent operations director for 7 months. I'm not saying anything tonight except that the kind of judgment you showed, both with that folder and with everything else I've watched you do this evening, is exactly what that position requires. Before I put someone in that chair with an MBA they paid too much for, I'd like to have a different kind of conversation." No. He didn't wait for Caleb to respond. He just nodded again, the way men of his generation nod when they've said what they came to say and don't need to add anything to it, and walked out through the door. Caleb looked at the business card on the table. He picked it up, looked at it long enough that Marcus, crossing the room toward him, noticed and glanced down at it as well. "Is that what I think it is?" Marcus asked. "I don't know what you think it is," Caleb said, which was not entirely truthful, because he knew exactly what Marcus thought it was. Marcus said, "Richard Voss doesn't hand out his direct line to people he's being polite to." Caleb put the card in his apron pocket. He went back to clearing plates. His hands did the work automatically while his mind was somewhere else, doing the mathematics of something that didn't have numbers yet, the specific calculation of a person who has been given unexpected information and needs to figure out what it actually changes, and whether it changes anything. What the right response to possibility is when you have trained yourself for years to be careful about possibility, because the cost of misreading it is too high. He thought about Sophie. He thought about the babysitter's house on Millbrook Drive, where she was right now, still watching her film, probably, or possibly already asleep on the couch, with one arm wrapped around the stuffed triceratops she carried everywhere and claimed she was too old to need. He thought about the fact that he had never told Sophie about the times he came home from a shift and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside, not because he was sad exactly. He'd intervened, but because he needed transition the space between the person who managed other people's evenings and the person who was someone's father. He pocketed the card more securely and kept working. Sloane Carrington was still at the table. She had not moved since her guests began leaving. Tessa intervened. She had her phone in her hand, but she wasn't looking at it, and she was someone sitting through a feeling rather than escaping it, which was not her usual posture. Her usual posture was forward motion. The absence of it was visible. When Caleb came back through the room with a clearing tray, she said, "Can I ask you something?" He set the tray down. "Yes, when I said what I said earlier when I had you removed." She stopped. seemed to decide something. Started again differently. You didn't look angry. I wasn't performing anything, Caleb said. That's what I mean. Most people I've been in enough situations to know what people look like when they're suppressing something. You weren't suppressing it. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the tablecloth. Were you not angry? Or are you just very practiced at it? Caleb considered the question honestly. He didn't take long. He said. She looked at him. I was frustrated, he said. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. But I've got a daughter at home and she's going to ask me how my night was when I pick her up. And I've made a decision about the kind of story I want to be able to tell her. He paused. The details. She's 8. But the shape of it. Whether her dad handled something hard well or badly. Sloan was quiet for a moment. How old is she? 8. You raise her alone? 4 years. She absorbed that. The way she absorbed it had a quality Caleb hadn't seen from her earlier in the evening, not analytical, not strategic. Just a person hearing something another person's about another person's life and letting it land. What's her name? Sophie. Sloan looked down at the table. That's a good name. It was an odd thing to say in the context of everything else, but it landed simply and without pretension, and Caleb received it simply. She's a good kid, he said. There was a pause that had a different quality than the pauses earlier in the evening. Earlier, the pauses in this room had been loaded with tension, with the machinery of judgment and business and implication. This one was just 2 people at the end of a difficult evening, and the space between words didn't need to be filled. Sloan said, I don't usually do that. Caleb waited. Make that kind of decision, that quickly. Based on, she pressed her lips together. I built a company by being a good reader of situations. I've always believed that. She looked up at him. Tonight was the clearest evidence I have ever had that I'm not as good at it as I thought. Caleb didn't say anything immediately. You're being very generous, Sloan continued, not saying what you could say. Which is, that you figured out what kind of person I was very quickly too. And you were right. Caleb picked up his clearing tray. He looked at her across the table. I don't know what kind of person you are, he said. I know what you did tonight. That's not the same thing. She looked at him like she wasn't entirely sure how to process that. People do things, Caleb said. He wasn't making a speech, he was saying a thing that was true and had been true for a long time, in his experience. Good people do things they shouldn't sometimes. Doesn't mean that's who they are. Just means they've got some work to do. He picked up the tray. You came back from it tonight. That's something. He carried the tray toward the service station. Behind him, he heard Sloan take a slow breath. No. And then the small sound of a woman who has been holding herself at a particular level of tension for several hours and is only now nearly empty room at the end of an evening that did not go the way she planned, allowing some of it to go. He didn't look back. He had work to finish. The main floor of the Belmont was winding down in the way Friday nights wound down the late diners on their second bottle of wine, the bar doing steady business, seed and fiend, the kitchen sending out its last orders with the particular efficiency of a team that could see the end of the night and was moving toward it. Caleb dropped his cleared load at the kitchen window, refilled his water pitcher, and checked on his remaining tables with the automatic attentiveness that had become, over 4 years, as natural as breathing. Table 4 had decided on a third dessert, which required a trip back to the kitchen. Table 6 was paying the check. Table 11 had asked for a box, which meant they were getting close. He was in the kitchen, waiting on the dessert for Table 4, when David appeared beside him. Yes, he'd intervened. David, the 24-year-old who had taken the private dining table and spent most of the evening looking slightly overwhelmed by it, was nursing a glass of water near the prep counter. He had the expression of a person who has come through a stressful experience and is not yet sure whether to be relieved or still anxious. You okay? Caleb asked, not looking up from the plating station. David drank some water. That was a weird night. It was. I've never had a table where everyone stops paying attention to the person running the meeting to talk about the server. It usually doesn't work like that, Caleb agreed. David was quiet for a second. Then, for what it's worth, I was trying to cover for you when Harrington asked. Didn't what to tell him. I know, you did fine. I feel like I did the opposite of fine. Caleb got the dessert from the plating station and looked at David. You stayed honest when you could have made something up. That's fine. He picked up the plate. The rest of it wasn't yours to fix. He went back out to the floor. At 11:10, his last table settled their check, and Caleb began his end-of-shift breakdown rolling silverware, consolidating the salt and pepper sets, confirming with the bus staff that the tables in his section were properly reset for the morning team. He did this with the specific focus of the very end of a long shift, when the body is tired enough to make small errors if you let it. He didn't let it. Marcus found him near the end of it, when most of the floor staff had already clocked out. "How are you doing?" Marcus asked. "I'm okay. That was a rough start to the night. It worked out." Marcus looked at him carefully. "I want you to know that I went to bat for you. When she asked for someone else, I told her you were the best I had." "You did," Caleb said. He meant it. "I also want to say," Marcus stopped, seemed to decide how to continue, "the way you came back in there tonight, without making it about you. Without I've seen servers in that situation make the other person feel small because they have the advantage." He shook his head. "You didn't do that." Caleb tied off the last silverware roll. "She was already feeling it. Didn't need my help. You could have let her feel it harder." What would have been the point? Marcus had no answer for that, which was, Caleb thought about the right response. He clocked out at 11:23, which was a little earlier than usual, which Marcus had arranged without saying he was doing it. He got his jacket from the staff room, a room that smelled perpetually of industrial detergent and someone's leftover coffee. And he checked his phone. A text from the babysitter, Angela, that said Sophie had made it to 10:15 before falling asleep on the couch, which was a personal best. A second text said she could stay until midnight, so no rush. He sat down in the staff room for a moment. Just a moment. He wasn't the type to dramatize the ends of things, including the end of a night like this one. But he sat down, and he let himself be still for a couple of minutes in the small, ugly room with the industrial smell and the fluorescent light that flickered every 40 seconds, and he thought about Voss's business card in his apron pocket. He thought about what it would mean to have better hours. He thought about what it would mean to pick Sophie up from school, Eitzel school pup. No, the actual school pickup in the car line with the other parent, instead of reading about it from her summaries over dinner at 9:30 when she was barely awake enough to eat. He thought about the woman sitting at the head of a long table who had looked at him and decided he wasn't worth seeing, and then later looked at him again and seen something else. He didn't feel triumphant about that. He wasn't built for triumph in that particular direction, the direction that required someone else's humiliation to feel good. He felt something more complicated and more tired, which was the feeling of a person who has been that the world is not consistently fair and has decided to keep going anyway, not because the unfairness doesn't matter, because the alternative is to stop. And he wasn't going to stop. He had a kid. Kids required you to keep going. He pulled out the business card, looked at it again in the ugly light. Richard Voss. Direct line. A conversation, not a promise. And Caleb Mercer was very good at knowing the difference between a door and an open door, and this was at least a door. He put the card in his wallet instead of his apron. You felt like the right place for it. He stood up, put his jacket on, turned the staff room, light off on his way out, which was the kind of thing he did, automatically the small habit of a person who had spent years being careful with things that belonged to other people, and had extended that carefulness to light switches and doors and borrowed objects, not from compulsion, but from the settled conviction that how you treat small things is more or less how you treat everything. Outside, the Westbridge night was cold in the particular way of early autumn, not bitter yet, but with a sharpness to it that reminded you something was coming. The restaurant's service entrance opened onto a side street, and he stood there for a moment toward his car, looking at the rectangle of light falling from the restaurant's main window onto the sidewalk. Inside, through the glass, he could see the bar was still going, and a couple of tables, and the movement of the staff doing what staff did at the end of a Friday night, the long, grinding work of returning a space to the condition it needs to be in before it can be used again. I've been doing that for years. He thought, maybe that changes. Pick up Sophie first. He walked to his car. The drive to Angela's house took 11 minutes on Friday nights, when the traffic had thinned out and the stoplights were cooperating. He knew the route the way. He knew most things he did repeatedly without having to think about them, which freed up his mind to be somewhere else. Tonight his mind was moving through the evening in the way you replay things after they've ended. Not with regret exactly, but with the evaluative quality of someone figuring out what they actually learned. He had learned that Voss kept better track of things than most people gave him credit for. He had learned that Harrington closed folders when he'd decided something and didn't close them again until he'd decided something else. He had learned that a woman who had spent a decade building authority could still be rattled by her own choices in a way that was underneath the polished surface of her, recognizably human. He wasn't sure what to do with any of that yet. Angela's porch light was on when he pulled up. It was always on when she was expecting him, which he had never asked her to do, but which she did anyway. The way people who are genuinely kind do things without being asked. He let himself in with the key. She had given him another thing that had happened without ceremony. She had just handed it to him one evening and said, "In case you're ever running late and I have to step out," which had never actually happened. But the key was still on his ring. Sophie was on the couch. She had her mother's coat thrown over her as a blanket, which was a choice that made no practical sense, since there were 3 actual blankets within reach. But Sophie had fixed preferences that didn't always track with logic, and her father had long since made his peace with that. Her arm was around the triceratops. Her hair had come mostly out of whatever it had been in at the start of the evening, and was spread across the couch cushion in a way that would take at least 6 minutes to detangle in the morning. Caleb stood in Angela's living room for a moment, looking at her. 8 years old, 3rd grade, future paleontologist, corrector of dinosaur classifications. His whole reason for every calculation he made. He crossed the room and crouched down next to the couch and put a hand on her shoulder, gently. Sophie's eyes opened immediately. She had always been a light sleeper, another thing she had in common with her father. And she looked at him for a second with the blurry, unfocused look of someone who isn't all the way back yet. "Dad, hey Bug, you're late. 11:30 isn't that late. It is when you have school on Monday." She pushed herself up slightly. "How was work?" He looked at his daughter in the soft lamplight of the babysitter's living room, with the triceratops under her arm and her hair disaster and her 8-year-old authority on what constituted a reasonable hour. "It was a night," he said. "Good night or bad night?" He thought about Sloane Carrington's face when she said, "I owe someone in this room an apology." He thought about Voss's business card in his wallet. He thought about Margaret Osey saying you handled tonight with a lot of grace, like it was a fact rather than a compliment. "Started bad," he said. "Ended okay." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most information. "Is okay," she decided. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Okay is okay." He scooped her up, coat and triceratops and all, and she made the specific complaint she always made about being carried. "I'm not a baby. I can walk while simultaneously not making any move to be put down." He thanked Angela on the way out, navigated the steps carefully, got Sophie into the back seat with the smooth routine of 4 years of Friday nights. On the drive home, she asked him about the dinosaur book she had requested from the library app, whether he had approved it on his phone yet, and he had not, because he had been working, and she accepted this information with the patience of someone accustomed to the fact that her father was a human being, with limited attention across multiple fronts. "I'll do it when we get home," he said. "You always say that and then you fall asleep." "I won't fall asleep, you will." He probably would. But he said, "I'll set an alarm to remind me." Sophie seemed to find this an acceptable compromise. She was quiet for a moment, watching the streetlights go by the window. Then she said, "Dad?" "Yeah." "The kid in my class, Marcus with the glasses. He said waiters don't have important jobs." She said it the way kids report things, not with judgment, just with the information, waiting to see what he does with it. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "What do you think?" he asked. Sophie was quiet for a second. "I think he's wrong," she said. "I think if you didn't do your job, a lot of people's evenings would be worse." He drove for a moment without saying anything. "Yeah," he finally said. "That's about right." Sophie put her head against the car window. The triceratops was wedged under her elbow. "Can we have pancakes tomorrow?" she asked. "We can have pancakes." "With the blueberries?" "If I have blueberries." "You always have blueberries." "Then yes." She was asleep again before they got home. He carried her inside, up the stairs into her room, which was organized in the specific a child with strong opinions, the dinosaur books arranged by size on the bottom shelf, The drawings she was currently working on spread across the desk, the small plastic tea, Rex on the windowsill, whose placement she had explained to him once in detail that he no longer fully remembered. He pulled the actual blanket over her, took the coat, stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. Tomorrow he would make pancakes with blueberries. He would sit across from her at the kitchen table, and she would tell him something about dinosaurs that he didn't know. He would drink his coffee, and she would drink her orange juice, and they would have the slow, unremarkable morning that unremarkable Saturday mornings were made of. And at some point, when the moment felt right, he would take out Voss's business card and think more carefully about what a conversation might mean, and what a door might lead to, and what it would feel like to build something different than what he had built so far. But that was tomorrow. Neat. He reached out and turned the light off on the way out of her room, and then he went down the hall to his own room, and he sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a moment, in the way he sometimes did at the end of things, thinking about anything particular, just being in the quiet. The house was still. Outside, the street was quiet. A car went by slowly, its headlights crossing the ceiling of his room in a slow arc. Okay is okay. He took off his shoes, lay back on top of the covers, still dressed, too tired to do anything else. Within 4 minutes, he's asleep, still in his work clothes, with the business card in his wallet on the nightstand, and his daughter asleep down the hall, and a night that had started badly and ended with something that, in the morning, would look a little more like the shape of a beginning. He did fall asleep in his work clothes. He woke up at 6:47 with his jacket still on and one shoe on the floor beside the bed where it had apparently fallen off at some point during the night without waking him, and a crick in his neck that informed him clearly that 32 was not 22, and sleeping on top of covers in work clothes had consequences that needed to be addressed before the body forgot what comfortable felt like. He lay there for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The business card was in his wallet on the nightstand. He was aware of it the way you are aware of something you put somewhere specific because you were trying not to lose it, a low-level background awareness that doesn't quite go away. Down the hall, Sophie was still asleep. He could tell because the specific sound of her being awake, which was a series of small sounds, drawers opening, things being moved, commentary delivered to no one in particular about whatever had occurred to her first that morning, was absent. The house had the particular quiet of a Saturday before 7, which was one of the few quiet things about it. He got up, changed his clothes, started the coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he stood the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, which was not much of a backyard by any objective measure, a narrow rectangle of grass, with a fence that needed repainting, and a single tree in the corner that Sophie had named Gerald, without explanation, when she was 5. Gerald was losing his leaves in the way trees did in early autumn, not all at once, but in the slow, decisive way of something that has made up its mind. The lawn needed raking. It had needed raking for 2 weeks. Caleb had been meaning to get to it on a weekend, and then working on those weekends and coming home too tired to do anything that didn't have an immediate consequence. He poured his coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out his wallet, and put Richard Voss's business card on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. In the plain light of a Saturday morning, without the weight of the evening around it, the card looked like what it was, a small rectangle of heavy stock paper, with a name and a number on it. It did not look like a turning point. Turning points rarely looked like what they were, in his experience. He looked like small rectangles of paper and open doors and moments you could walk past without noticing if you were moving too fast. He was trying not to move too fast. The card said Richard Voss, direct and then a number. That was all. Caleb was not a person who romanticized opportunity. He had learned the hard way, and over some years, that opportunity required its own kind of labor, the labor of figuring out what was real and what was flattery, what was a genuine door and what was a door painted on a wall. Voss had said there was a conversation to be had. Not a job. A conversation. Caleb was holding that word carefully, because it was the honest word, the one that didn't promise more than it was offering, and he respected that even as it made him cautious. He thought about what the job description might actually mean. Hospitality Management Division. Operations Director. Those were large words. He had no degree. He had 4 years of floor experience at one restaurant, preceded by 3 years at a mid-range place across town that had eventually closed, preceded by a series of other jobs that belonged to a version of his life that had been interrupted and rearranged by Route 9 and everything that came after. He also had 4 years of solving problems that other people didn't see coming. He had the judgment that Voss apparently found worth mentioning. He had the kind of competence that comes not from a classroom, but from 10,000 small decisions made correctly in real time. He was honest enough with himself to know that this was a real thing, even if he had never had language for it that transferred cleanly to a resume. He drank his coffee. He was still looking at the card when the sound of Sophie's morning routine began. The drawer, the commentary, the specific pattern of footsteps that meant she had decided to wear the sneakers that required both hands to tie, and had remembered mid-morning that she had not yet mastered the technique. She appeared in the kitchen doorway 7 minutes later, with her hair in a state that he had come to think of as structurally ambitious. She had clearly attempted something with a hair elastic, and achieved a result that was neither what she'd intended nor a complete failure, just its own thing. She had her school sweatshirt on inside out, which she noticed as she sat down and corrected without comment. "You didn't fall asleep," she said. "I did fall asleep. I just woke up before you. That's not what I meant." She looked at the card on the table. "What's that?" "A business card." "Whose?" "Someone I work with. Adjacent to work." He picked it up and put it back in his wallet. "Blueberries." "What?" "You asked for pancakes with blueberries. I'm asking if you still want them." Sophie looked at him with the expression she used when she suspected she was being redirected and was deciding whether to pursue it. She was very good at noticing redirection. It was, he acknowledged privately, a trait she had inherited from him, and it was much more charming as a quality in a parent than as a quality in a child, asking about things you weren't ready to discuss yet. "Yes," she said, "with the blueberries." He made the pancakes. She ate them with the methodical satisfaction of someone who has wanted a specific thing and received it. She ate around the blueberries first and then ate the blueberries separately, which was a system she had developed at age 6 and had never deviated from, and which Caleb had long since stopped questioning. Pancakes were Sophie's food. She had strong opinions about pancakes. Her opinions were correct. While she ate, she told him about a disagreement she was having with her best friend Emma about whether a stegosaurus could beat a triceratops in a fight. Sophie's position was that the triceratops had a significant advantage in terms of offensive capability, but that the stegosaurus had better defensive architecture, and that the outcome would depend entirely on terrain. Emma's position was that the stegosaurus would definitely win because it was bigger, which Sophie found to be an unsatisfying level of analysis. Caleb listened to this with the full attention he brought to Sophie's debates. Because Sophie could tell the difference between being listened to and being appeared to be listened to, and because, in his opinion, she was correct that terrain was a factor. "What kind of terrain?" he asked. Sophie pointed her fork at him. "That's the right question. Dense forest versus open plain. Triceratops has the advantage on open ground. Better charge geometry. And in forest? Still probably Triceratops. The horns are more adaptable than the Stegosaurus plates in close quarters. It's closer. She ate a blueberry. Emma just doesn't think about variables. Tell Emma to think about variables." "I tell Emma everything," Sophie said, with the tone of a person who has been carrying this burden for some time. After breakfast, she went to her room to work on her current drawing project, which involved a detailed scene of a Cretaceous coastline Wheatstama gull that she had been working on for 3 weeks and refused to show him until it was finished. He cleaned up the kitchen. He raked the backyard. Finally, and the physical work of it was good, the kind of work that used his body and let his mind run alongside without having to be managed. He thought about Voss's card. He thought about Sloane Carrington's face in the empty dining room. Thought about the intervened. He thought about the shape of things. He pulled out his phone and called his sister. Diane lived 40 minutes north of Westbridge, in a house she shared with her husband and their 3 kids, and she answered on the 3rd ring with the sound of Saturday morning background noise behind her cartoons, a child asking about something. A door. "Hey," she said. "Hold on." Then away from the phone, I said after breakfast. "Back. Okay. What's up?" "I need to tell you about last night." He told her about it. The short version because Diane was the person he talked to when he needed the short version heard, rather than the long version. And she was good at asking the right question at the right place without filling spaces with noise. When he got to the part about Voss's business card, Diane was quiet for a second. Operations director? That's what he said. That's not a small thing. I'm aware. Are you going to call him? He leaned against the fence post at the back of the yard, looking at the pile of leaves he'd made. I'm trying to decide what I actually think about it. What's there to think about? Whether I'm qualified. Whether it's real. Whether he's stopped. Whether you deserve it, Diane asked, and the directness of it landed the way directness from someone who has known you your whole life lands without cushioning, which was exactly why it was useful. Exactly, he said. More like whether I'm reading the situation accurately. Whether I'm the person for that kind of job, or whether he was having a generous moment at the end of a strange evening. The difference between those two things is whether you make the call, Diane said. If you call and he's in the second category, you find out. If you don't call, you never know, and you stay at the Belmont, making $12 an hour, plus tips and raking your backyard. $14.50, whatever it is. Call him, Caleb. He looked at Gerald, losing leaves in the corner of the yard. I'll think about it. You've been thinking since last night. Call him. He laughed a little. Since when did you get impatient? Since I watched you not do things for 3 years because you were being careful. Careful is good. Careful is also sometimes the word people use when they mean afraid. She paused. You're not afraid. I might be a little afraid. Okay, well, be afraid and call him. He hung up and stood in the backyard for a little longer, and then he went inside, washed his hands, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the card for probably 30 seconds, more than was useful. Then he called. It rang twice. Voss picked up on the second ring with the directness of a man who had given out his direct number for exactly the purpose of having it used. Voss, Mr. Voss, this is Caleb Mercer, from the Belmont last night. A beat, then. I wasn't sure you'd call this quickly. I'm not good at drawing things out. Neither am I. There was the sound of a door closing on Voss's end, and then the ambient noise dropped, and he had the sense that Voss had moved somewhere more private. What did you think about what I said? Caleb had prepared for a version of this question. He said, I thought it was generous, and I thought I needed to find out if it was more than that. It's more than that, Voss said. But I want to be clear with you, because I don't believe in wasting people's time. I didn't offer you a job last night. I offered you a conversation about whether a job makes sense. Do you understand the difference? Yes. Good. Because the position is real, and it's been vacant for 7 months. And in that time, I've interviewed 8 people, all of them with credentials that look excellent on paper. And I haven't hired any of them. Why? Caleb waited. Because credentials are what people show you when they want you to believe they can do something, Voss said. I watched you handle a genuinely complicated situation last night with a quality of judgment that none of those 8 interviews produced. I want to understand where that comes from and whether it applies to a broader context and what it would take to test it properly. He paused. That's the conversation. Can you come in Monday morning? Caleb thought about his schedule. Monday he was off from the Belmont. Sophie's school started at 8:15. Monday works, he said. 10 o'clock. I'll send you the address. Thank you, Mr. Voss. Don't thank me yet, Voss said, without unfriendliness. I'm hard to impress in an office. You had the advantage last night of a context that showed me something real. Offices don't always do that. I understand. See you Monday. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Caleb sat at the kitchen table after it ended and did not do anything for a moment except look at the wall and process the fact that it had happened. Then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, wanting to know if he had checked the dinosaur book yet. He had not. He did it immediately. The rest of Saturday passed in the way. Saturdays passed when you had an 8-year-old who ran on a schedule determined entirely by her own internal clock. Breakfast had been early, which meant lunch was early, which meant the afternoon stretched out in the particular wide way of a day with no fixed endpoint, and Sophie filled it with the Cretaceous coastline drawing and a long argument via video call with Emma about the Stegosaurus question, yet during which Caleb made dinner and listened to his daughter deploy the terrain argument with the confidence of someone who has thought about this seriously and knows it. Emma's position did not appear to shift, but Sophie didn't need Emma to agree. She just needed to make the case. After dinner, when Sophie was in the bath, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his phone and opened a browser and searched for the first time the specific name of the position Voss had described. He read for 45 minutes, not frantically methodically, the way he did most, moving through what he found with the evaluative attention of someone trying to build an honest picture rather than a flattering one. Operations directors and hospitality management were responsible for things he had been doing elements of for years, just at a scale that stopped at the edge of his section. Dining floor operations. He knew service standards. He knew staff management in the informal way that senior servers manage junior ones. He knew how to read a room and how to solve a problem and how to make a judgment call that held up under scrutiny. He did not know budgets at this scale. He did not know contract management. He did not know the specific language of the industry at the corporate level. He wrote those things down on a piece of paper, not as failures, as the actual shape of what he was walking into, which he needed to know before Monday. He was still writing when Sophie called from the bathroom that she was done. He put the paper in his jacket pocket and went to get her towel. Sunday was quieter. Sophie had declared it a drawing day, which meant she was in her room for most of the morning and emerged for meals with the slightly distracted look of someone whose mind was still partly in a Cretaceous coastline. Caleb used the morning to do laundry, to deal with 3 weeks of small maintenance tasks that had accumulated, to call Angela and confirm she was available for the following Friday night. He also put on the only suit he owned. He had bought it for a cousin's wedding 4 years ago and had worn it twice since then, including once to a parent-teacher conference that had not required a suit but that he had dressed for, because the specific teacher in question was known for making parents feel like students, and he had wanted to be the kind of parent who made that dynamic harder to establish. The suit was charcoal gray and still fit, which was one of the things he'd been quietly hoping about it. He stood in front of the mirror on the back of his bedroom door and looked at himself in it for a moment. He looked like a version of himself he didn't see very often. He wasn't sure that was good or bad. He just needed it to be credible for Monday morning. So Sophie knocked and then opened the door without waiting, which was her standard approach to knocking, and looked at him. "Why are you dressed like that?" she asked. "I have a meeting Monday." "What kind of meeting?" He turned away from the mirror. "An important one. Someone wants to talk to me about a different kind of job." Sophie considered this. "Different from the restaurant?" "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment with the kind of look 8-year-olds give adults when they're taking something seriously. "Is it a good different or a scary different?" He thought about it. "Bit of both," he said. Sophie nodded. This seemed to satisfy her as an honest answer. "The suit's good," she said. Then she left. He took the suit off and hung it back up. Monday morning came the way important mornings tend to unremarkably, starting with the same alarm and the same coffee and the same negotiation with Sophie about the state of her hair, which had entered a new phase of complexity now that she had opinions about how it looked, but had not yet fully acquired the manual skills to execute those opinions. He got her to school 7 minutes before the bell, with her backpack on correctly, and her lunch in her bag, and her hair in a style that she had described as good enough, which in Sophie's vocabulary meant she had made peace with it. He drove to the Voss Capital offices with the piece of paper from Sunday night in his jacket pocket. The offices were in a building that was not trying to impress you with its exterior, which Caleb noted as interesting. It was a mid-rise in the financial district, clean and serious, with a lobby that was comfortable without being lavish. He gave his name to the front desk. He was taken up to the 14th floor by a woman who introduced herself as Patricia and who walked at a pace that suggested she assumed he could, which he could. The conference room Voss led him into was small, just a table, and 4 chairs and a window that looked out over a slice of the city. Voss was already there when he arrived, without assistants or colleagues, which Caleb registered as intentional. "Sit down," Voss said, not unfriendly, just direct. Caleb sat. Voss had a folder in front of him that he didn't open. "I want to ask you some questions," he said. "Not interview questions. The kind you can't prepare for. Okay, tell me about a time you made a bad call. Caleb had expected something like this. He had not, however, prepared a particular answer, because he had decided on Sunday night that the answers he gave on Monday needed to be the actual answers rather than the managed versions, because Voss had demonstrated that he valued the actual thing over the strategic version of it, and walking in with performed answers felt like an error in that context. 6 months into my job at the Belmont, Caleb said there was a situation where a guest became verbally aggressive with a junior server, a woman who had been there 3 months. The guest was wrong, but instead of handling it the way I should have, which was to de-escalate and involve the manager, I stepped in directly and it escalated. The guest complained. The manager had to comp the table. The junior server was embarrassed because the situation got bigger than it needed to. Voss was watching him without expression. What did you learn from it? That the point is the outcome, not the principle. I was right about the principle. The outcome was worse because of how I chose to defend it. He paused. I still think about it when I'm deciding whether to step in directly or route something to management. Do you always get that right now? No, Caleb said. I get it right more often. Something shifted fractionally in Voss's expression. Approval exactly more like a door coming slightly more open. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Voss asked about operations, about problems, about decisions, always about the actual thing rather than the theoretical version of it. Caleb answered with what he knew and said plainly when he didn't know something, including when the thing he didn't know was whether he could do this job at the level it required. Voss said that's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have. The previous 8 candidates all assured me they could do the job. Voss looked at him. I found that very discouraging. At the end of the conversation, not the interview, Voss had been consistent about calling it a conversation. Voss leaned back in his chair and looked at Caleb with the considering expression of someone who has gathered the information they came for and is now running through it. I'm going to be direct with you, Voss said. You're not the typical profile for this position. Degree, no corporate management history. My board will ask questions. I understand that. I'm going to tell them that the last time they asked me to hire credentials over judgment, we had an operations director for 2 years who had an excellent resume and made 7 decisions in that time that each cost us more than his annual salary. He paused. What that experience taught me? What credentials don't guarantee, Caleb said. Voss nodded. I want you to meet with my VP of Hospitality this week. Her name is Linda Park. She'll go deeper on the operational specifics. I want you to spend a day with the current operations team and see how you read the problems they're managing. He looked at Caleb steadily. I'm not offering you the job. I want to be clear about that. I understand, but I'm investing time in this, which is a thing I don't do lightly. Caleb left the building at 12:20 and stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment. In the October noon light, watching taxis go by and a woman walking a dog who was absolutely not interested in walking, and a man on a phone who was having a conversation that required significant gesturing. He thought, Diane was right. He bought a sandwich from a place 2 blocks from the building and ate it in his car and called Diane to tell her how it went. And Diane said nothing for a moment and then said, I told you to call him, which was not the most useful response, but was very in character. He was back at the Belmont that evening for his regular shift. Walking through the service entrance at 5:45 felt the same as it always did. The kitchen noise, the prep cooks, the smell of the evening's first courses moving through the pass. He put on his apron. He checked the assignment board. He pulled out his notebook. Marcus was in the office when Caleb walked by and looked up through the window. He gave Caleb the specific look of a manager who knew something had changed in the periphery of his stiffing situation and was not yet sure what to do with that information. Caleb gave him a look back that communicated, I'll tell you when there's something to tell. So, Marcus nodded and went back to his paperwork. The evening was a regular Friday. Tables turned, courses were served, problems were solved at the small scale that small problems required. Caleb moved through his section with the attention and efficiency that had characterized 4 years of doing this work in this place, and he felt, for the first time, the strange double quality of being very good at a thing, while simultaneously standing slights outside it. No, the feeling of someone who is beginning to understand that a place they have inhabited can be left because it was bad, but because something beyond it has become visible. He didn't let the feeling affect his performance. That was not how he was built. At 8:30, a couple at table 9 asked him how long he had been working at the Belmont. 4 years, he said. You're very good at this, the woman said. She was maybe 60 with the direct warmth of someone who said what she thought when it was a good thing. Thank you, Caleb said. Have you always wanted to work in hospitality? He looked at her for a moment. Yet he'd intervened. He thought about a 14-year-old version of himself who had not had a clear answer to what he wanted, and a 22-year-old version who had been finding out, and a 28-year-old version who had been surviving, and the 32-year-old version standing at a table in a restaurant where he had been good at something for 4 years and was maybe on the edge of finding out what else he could be. I wanted to be good at what I did, he said. This is where I found out I was. The woman smiled. That's a better answer than most people have. He moved on to the next table. The shift ended at 11. He clocked out. He drove to Angela's. Sophie's was awake this time, and sitting at Angela's kitchen table with a book about prehistoric marine life that she had apparently found on Angela's shelf and had been reading since 9 o'clock without asking permission, which Angela had not seemed to mind. Sophie looked up when he came in. Dad, do you know how big a mosasaurus was? Pretty big. Bigger than a school bus. That's big. It could eat a shark. She said this with the satisfaction of someone delivering information they consider important. A whole shark. That sounds efficient. It was a very good predator. She closed the book, which had a small note stuck between the pages marking her place. Angela said I could borrow this. Angela, from the other room, she can have it. I've had it since college. Sophie held the book against her chest. She looked at Caleb with the specific look she used when she was about to ask something she had been holding on to. How did the meeting go? She asked. The one you wore the suit for. He picked up her jacket from the back of the chair and handed it to her. Went well. Are you going to get the different job? No yet. There's more to find out. Sophie put her jacket on. She tucked the marine life book under her arm. She looked up at him with the particular quality of attention that she had sometimes not all the time. She was 8, and her attention went many places, but when she directed it fully at him, it had a weight to it that he had never quite gotten used to. I think you would be good at it, she said, whatever it is. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, standing in Angela's kitchen at 11:15 on a Monday night with a book about mosasaurs and her jacket on crooked, and her full conviction that her father was capable of things she had no specific information about. He didn't say anything for a moment because he didn't need to. He just reached over and straightened her jacket collar, and she let him. And they said goodbye to Angela and walked to the car under the October sky with its cold clarity and its particular October smell of things changing and cooling and preparing for something different. Sophie talked about mosasaurs for the first 6 minutes of the drive home. He listened to every word. The meeting with Linda Park happened on Wednesday. She was 51, sharp in the way of people who have spent decades in operational roles and have consequently lost all patience for performance and retained only the useful things. She had short gray hair and reading glasses. She wore on a chain around her neck that she picked up and put down with the frequency of someone who needed them, but kept forgetting she already had them. Her office was organized in a way that suggested she made real decisions in it, papers and actual tests, a whiteboard with actual numbers on it, 2 coffee cups on the desk that indicated she had been working since before Caleb arrived, and had not fully resolved the question of which one was current. She shook his hand, sat down, got directly to it. Richard told me about Friday night, she said. I'm not going to pretend that context doesn't exist, but I'm also not going to let it do too much work for me. I need to understand what you actually know about operations, not what one impressive evening implies. That's fair, Caleb said. Good. Because the last person we hired on instinct rather than evidence lasted 4 months. She picked up her reading glasses, put them down again without using them. Walk me through a typical service night, what it should look like, what it actually looks like, and where things go wrong. He walked her through it. He talked about the gap between what a floor looks like at 5 o'clock and what it looks like at 8 o'clock on a Friday, and how the problems in the second condition are almost always created in the first condition how most floor managers responded to problems as they appeared, rather than creating systems that reduced their frequency. He talked about staff communication, about how information moved or failed to move between the kitchen and the floor and the host stand, and about the specific ways those failures compounded. He talked about the guest who had the shellfish sensitivity on Friday night, not to tell that story again, but as an example of what a system failure looked like. The information had existed. The sensitivity was real. The kitchen could have accommodated it, but there was no mechanism at the point of reservation to capture and transmit it. Linda Park listened with the quality of attention that takes notes without visibly doing so. When he finished, she said, "What would you change, structurally, to address that specific failure?" He told her. It was a 15-minute answer that covered reservation intake, pre-service briefing, kitchen communication protocol, and a flag system that could be managed digitally or on paper, depending on the operation. He had thought about versions of this problem for 4 years. He had talked to Marcus about pieces of it, and Marcus had implemented some of them, and not others. He was not speaking from theory. He was speaking from the specific knowledge of a person who had watched the same failure happen in different forms across a long time and had been building a model for addressing it in the back of his mind the entire while. Linda Park let him finish. She picked up her reading glasses. This time she put them on. She looked at him over the top of the frames. "You've been doing this in your head for 4 years, she said. It wasn't a question. "Closer to 6, he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "The 8 candidates Richard mentioned," she said. "Do you want to know why I eliminated them before he did?" He waited. "Because when I asked them what they would change, they all described what they had read about what should be changed." She took the glasses off. "You described what you'd actually seen. Those are different things." She stood up. "Come with me." She took him through the building to a conference room where 3 members of the current operations team were already seated: a man in his 40s named Greg, who ran logistics, a woman named Teresa, who handled staff coordination across the portfolio's properties, and a younger guy, maybe 27, named Sam, who had the restless energy of someone who had been given responsibility faster than he'd expected it and was still calibrating. Linda introduced Caleb without title or context. Just his name, which he noted. "We have 3 open problems," she said to the room. "I want to work through them. Caleb's going to sit in." She sat down. "Elm Street property. Go." What followed was 2 hours that Caleb had not entirely anticipated. The problems Greg presented were real: a staffing shortage at one of the portfolio's downtown properties that had been running at 68% capacity for 6 weeks, a vendor contract dispute that was affecting food costs across 2 properties, and a guest complaint pattern at a 3rd location that had appeared in 3 consecutive weeks of reviews and hadn't been diagnosed yet. Caleb mostly listened for the first 40 minutes. Yes, he'd summed fine. He listened the way he listened on the floor, not waiting for his turn, but actually taking things in, mapping the shape of the problem against what he already understood. Yes, he'd intervened, looking for the thing that wasn't being said, because everyone in the room already assumed it was understood. The staffing shortage discussion had been going in circles before he said anything. Greg kept returning to recruitment: more interviews, wider search radius, higher starting rate. Teresa kept returning to scheduling: better shift distribution, overtime management. Neither of them was wrong. Both of them were looking at symptoms. Caleb said, "Can I ask something?" Linda Park looked at him. "Go ahead, the 68%. "When did it start?" 6 weeks ago, Greg said. "What changed 6 weeks ago?" Greg looked at Teresa. Teresa looked at Greg. "A beat. We brought in a new floor manager," Teresa said slowly, "at the Elm Street property. And the turnover since then? Beat longer this time." 4 people, Greg said. He said it with the tone of a person who has just seen something they should have seen 3 weeks ago. "Do you have exit interview data from those 4? "We have 2. The other 2 didn't complete the form." "What did the 2 say?" Greg opened a folder he had not opened until this moment. He read in silence for about 30 seconds. His expression shifted. "Management style," he said. Teresa said, "Oh, Sam, the 27-year-old, leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly. Linda Park looked at Caleb. Her expression was the expression of someone who is confirming a hypothesis. Caleb said, "The staffing shortage is downstream of something else." Linda said, "It is." She looked at the room. "That's 2 weeks of discussion we could have avoided." She didn't say it unkindly, but she said it plainly. They moved through the other two problems. Caleb contributed at the margins of the vendor discussion because contracts were not his strongest ground, and he said so, but he caught something in the complaint pattern analysis, a timing issue. 3 incidents all occurring between 7 and 8:30 p.m., all involving wait times that pointed to a kitchen throughput problem during a specific service window rather than the front-of-house failure the team had been attributing it to. Sam worked through the data with him on a whiteboard, while Greg and Teresa took a break, and by the time the break was over, they had a cleaner picture of what was actually happening and where the intervention needed to go. When the session ended, Linda walked Caleb back to the elevator. They stood in the hallway outside it. "How did that feel?" she asked. He considered it honestly. "Harder than the floor," he said. "Different kind of hard. The floor gives you immediate feedback. Problems have faces. You can see when something works." She pressed the elevator button. "This work has a longer loop. You make a decision today, and you find out in 3 weeks whether it was right. Some people find that intolerable. Do I seem like I find it intolerable?" She looked at him sideways. "No. You seem like someone who makes decisions by actually thinking about them, which means the longer loop probably suits you better than you know." The elevator came. Caleb stepped in, held the door for a second. He said, "The floor manager at Elm Street. That conversation is going to be hard. For whoever has to have it." "It usually is, but it's the job," he said. She nodded. "It's the job." The doors closed. He drove back across the city thinking about the Elm Street property and the floor manager and the 4 people who had left and the 2 who had filled out exit forms and the specific kind of cost that was invisible on a spreadsheet until you added up the recruitment hours and the training time and the lost institutional knowledge of experienced staff and put it next to the number that it would have cost to have the conversation with the manager 6 weeks ago. He thought about Marcus. About the way Marcus ran the Belmont, the difficult conversations he had, the things he caught early, the things he let go too long, the specific texture of what it looked like to manage a place well versus managing it adequately. He had spent 4 years watching Marcus. He had not known he was doing it as preparation for anything. He had just been paying attention, because that was what he did. He picked Sophie up from school that afternoon, for the first time in 3 weeks. He was in the car line at 310, which was a line that moved with the particular geology of car line, slow, occasionally stopping for reasons that were not visible from your position, requiring patience that was less meditative, and more just the basic tolerance of a person who is willing to sit in their car for 11 minutes to see their kid come out the front doors of a school. Sophie appeared at 3:22 with her backpack on correctly and her lunch bag in her hand and a piece of paper that flapped against her leg as she walked. She was talking to a girl beside her, Emma. Caleb guessed from the context with the animated quality she had. When she was in the middle of an argument, she was winning. She saw the car, said something to Emma that looked like a quick goodbye, and came toward him. She opened the back door, got in, threw her backpack on the seat next to her. "You're here," she said. "I'm here. Usually it's Angela on Wednesdays." She looked at the back of his head as he pulled forward in the line. "Did you take the day off?" "I had meetings this morning. Done by noon." "Oh." She was quiet for a second. He could feel her processing the unusualness of this, which was the fact of her father being in the car line, which should not be unusual, but which had been, for a while. "Can we go to the park?" He had not planned to go to the park. He also had no specific reason not to. "The one on Clement or the one on Ashby?" "The one with the good swings." "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They went to the park on Clement Street, which had swings that she approved of, on the grounds that they were the long chain kind rather than the short chain kind, which apparently produced a superior arc. She swung for 20 minutes while he sat on a nearby bench that was slightly damp from the morning's rain and had a broken slat on the left side, neither of which she cared about because she was not the one sitting on it. From the bench, he watched her swing with the total physical commitment of someone who had not yet been taught to be self-conscious about things like swinging, and he thought about what it would mean to be here on Wednesdays. to be in the car line, to sit on damp benches, to have the afternoons with her that he had been losing to the schedule of a job that ran, fundamentally, on the hours that other people's evenings required. No, he thought about the Voss Capital meeting schedule. Linda Park had mentioned that the operations team worked 9 to 6 most days, with occasional evening site visits that ran later, and to 6, Monday through Friday. He would pick her up every day. The thought moved through him with a quiet force that he was not prepared for sitting on a damp bench in October. He had not let himself want things this specific in a long time. Wanting specific things created specific expectations, and he had spent 4 years managing expectations carefully because the cost of mismanaging them was paid by Sophie, and he was not going to do that to her. But this felt different from hope. It felt more like arithmetic. The pieces were there. The door was there. He just had to do the work of walking through it. Sophie called from the swing. "Watch." He watched. She pumped the swing to its maximum viable height, and then released at the forward peak, and came off in the specific kind of half-controlled, half-chaotic arc that children produce when they are doing something that has a non-trivial probability of ending badly, and are doing it anyway because they're 8 and they live in their bodies, in a way adults mostly forget. She landed on both feet, stumbled forward 2 steps, and caught herself. Turned around grinning. "Did you see?" she said. "I saw," he said. "I've been working on the landing. The landing needs some more work. I almost had it." "You almost had it," he agreed. She came and sat next to him on the bench, which she immediately noticed was damp. She made a face but stayed. "Emma thinks I'm wrong about the Triceratops," she said. She said she looked it up, and Stegosaurus is bigger, so it wins. "Did you tell her that size is one variable?" I said terrain, and she said that doesn't count. Sophie picked at the edge of her sleeve. "I think she just doesn't want to think about it that hard. Some people don't." "Why?" He considered this. "I don't know exactly. It's just different from how you think. Doesn't make her wrong about other stuff." Sophie considered this with the slightly resistant look of someone filing information they're not fully ready to accept. "I guess," she said. They stayed at the park until 4:30. On the drive home, she told him about a project her class was starting on ecosystems, which she had opinions about, and a book her teacher had read aloud that had ended badly for a character she had liked, which she was processing in the way that children process things, not quietly, but at length, working the feeling was by putting words around it. He listened. He made dinner while she did her homework at the kitchen table, pasta with the sauce she could identify in the pot from the smell, and would tell him he'd put too much garlic in, which he always did, and which she always mentioned, and which neither of them had any intention of changing. "Too much garlic," she said when the bowls were on the table. "You always say you know." "Because I do know." "Why do you keep—" "Because it tastes better." She looked at her bowl. Ate a bite. The expression she made was the expression of someone who is not going to admit that something is correct. They ate in the easy quiet of people who live together and don't need to fill every space. After dinner, after homework was finished, and the plates were in the sink, Sophie was at her desk, continuing the Cretaceous coastline drawing, and Caleb was at the kitchen table looking at his phone when it buzzed with a message from a number he didn't have saved. He read it. "This is Sloane Carrington. I got your number from Marcus Chen. I hope that's all right. I wanted to reach out and say that I've been thinking about what you said Friday night about your daughter. About what you didn't say, which was probably more. I'm not sure what I'm asking for exactly. I think I just needed to say that it stayed with me. You don't have to respond." He read it twice. He put his phone down, looked at the kitchen wall. The clock on the kitchen wall read 7:58 and made its small, consistent ticking sound that he mostly didn't notice except in moments of particular quiet. He thought about whether to respond. He was not by nature a person who avoided things. He was also not a person who responded to things before he understood what the response needed to be. Zephad mained, which was a distinction that mattered to him, because the difference between those two things was usually the difference between saying something true and saying something that sounded true. He picked up the phone. He typed, "It's fine that you have the number. What stayed with you?" He sent it, before he could manage it, into something more careful. The response came 4 minutes later, the part about what you tell her, about the kind of man you choose to be when things are hard. "I've been thinking about whether I have an equivalent of that, something I'm trying to be when it's hard." I'm not sure I do. He read this. He thought about Sloane Carrington the way he had seen her. Friday night in the first moment, the polished external version that had looked at him and found him insufficient. The later version, in the empty room, and with her laptop pushed aside and her hands on the table and the careful managed surface of her coming partly down in the way things come down when a person is tired and honest. He typed, "That's not a small thing to notice about yourself." "It isn't." A pause. "Then how is she?" "Your daughter." Yes, he'd intervened. He looked at the hallway that led to Sophie's room, where the light was still on and he could faintly hear the sound of her pencil moving across paper. He typed, "She's drawing a Cretaceous coastline. She's been working on it for a month." Sloane wrote, "What's in it?" "She hasn't shown me yet. It's not finished." She sounds like a serious person. She is. She's 8, and she's already more rigorous about evidence than most adults I know. A longer pause this time. "Then I owe you more than an apology in a restaurant. I want you to know I understand that." He thought about how to respond to this. He intervened. He thought about the fact that Sloane Carrington had spent the last 5 days carrying something that most people in her position would have set down by Saturday morning and moved past. He thought about what it meant that she hadn't. He typed, "You don't owe me anything beyond what you said. What you do with what you learned, that's not something you owe me. That's just for you." A long pause. "Then I'm changing something at my company, in how we evaluate people. It's going to make some people uncomfortable." "Is that why you're telling me?" "I think I wanted you to know it wasn't just a conversation." He sat with that for a moment. He wrote, "Good." He put the phone down. Outside, the October evening had settled into the particular cold of 9 o'clock. Through the kitchen window, he could see the backyard with Gerald's remaining leaves catching the light from inside the house and the pile he had raked on Saturday still sitting in the corner, because he had raked it but not yet bagged it, which was a thing he would get to this weekend if the weather held. He thought about the week ahead. Thursday he was back on the floor at the Belmont for his regular shift. Friday, Linda Park had arranged for him to spend 6 hours at the Elm Street property, with the operations team there, walking the floor, watching service, talking to the staff. As a candidate, she had said. As someone trying to understand a place. The distinction mattered, and he understood why she made it. He thought about the floor manager at Elm Street, whose name he now knew was a man named Troy, who had come into his role with strong technical skills and weak people skills, which was a combination that looked fine in an interview and showed its problems only after it had made them. He thought about whether Troy could be developed, or whether Troy was in the wrong position, and those were different conversations with different outcomes, and he didn't know yet which one he was walking into. He thought about 4 people who had left. Their institutional knowledge gone, their experience lost. The specific cost of that, measured not just in recruitment and training, but in the subtler cost of a floor that didn't function as well as it had, because the people who knew how it worked were no longer there. He'd intervened. He thought about the fact that he was thinking about all of this, and that it felt like a kind of thinking that had always been available to him but had not had a place to go. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I'm going to bed," she said. "I was going to keep drawing, but I'm tired." "Okay." She stood there for a second. "Are you still doing the thing where you sit in the kitchen and think about stuff?" Okay, she seemed unbothered by this. "Good night." Bug. She disappeared. He heard the bathroom teeth brushing, the specific sound of the faucet that dripped slightly on the cold water side, and then her room door. He stayed at the kitchen table. The week moved forward, in the way weeks did, when something was in motion, but not yet resolved with a specific texture of waiting that isn't passive, but requires you to keep doing the daily work, while the larger thing works itself out. He served his Thursday shift at the Belmont, with the full attention he always brought to it. He talked to Marcus briefly at the end of the night, in the way they sometimes talked when the floor had gone quiet. "You had a meeting at Voss Capital," Marcus said. It wasn't quite a question. 2, Caleb said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man who understood what this meant and was deciding how to feel about it. Marcus was not a person who made his feelings large, which was one of the things Caleb had always respected about him. "How did it go?" Marcus asked. "Well, I think. Still working out." Marcus nodded. He looked at the half-cleared table in front of them, at the restaurant around them that was winding down in its reliable way. You're the best person I have, he said. I want you to know I know that. No, you know, Caleb said. And I want you to know I'm not going to make it complicated for you. If something comes through. Caleb looked at him. That matters. I've got David coming up fast, Marcus said. He's going to be good. He just needs time. He picked up a salt shaker from the table and set it back. Place doesn't stop running because good people move forward. That's how it's supposed to work. He walked back toward the office. Caleb watched him go. He thought about 4 years. He thought about all the Friday nights and the problem tables and the difficult guests and the junior servers he had helped and the things Marcus had handled before they became Caleb's problems. He thought about what a place gives you and what you give back to it and the particular mutual exchange that builds up quietly over years without either party formally acknowledging it. He finished his breakdown. He clocked out. Friday morning, he drove to the Elm Street property at 8:45 and spent 6 hours on the floor. The Elm Street property was not the Belmont. It was newer, larger, more corporate in its layout. Sesame serving a lunch-heavy business clientele with a dinner service that ran till 10. It had the particular energy of a place that was technically doing everything right and practically doing several things wrong, in ways that didn't show up on metrics but showed up in the atmosphere, the way the staff moved and communicated, and the small tensions that were visible if you knew what you were looking at. He walked the floor with a woman named Carla, who was the assistant floor manager, and had been there 2 years and possessed the specific kind of competence that goes unrecognized when the person above you is taking up all the oxygen. She showed him the service stations, the communication systems, the pre-service briefing structure. Yes, and she answered his questions directly and without certainty when she didn't have it, which he noted. At one point between the lunch and dinner service, when the floor was in the in-between state of being set up for the evening but not yet active, he said to Carla, "Tell me what you'd change if you could change one thing." She looked at him, measured something. "The pre-service briefing," she said. "Troy runs it at 4:30, which is before half the evening staff arrives. So half the room is hearing the day's information secondhand from the other half, and some of it doesn't get there. How long has that been the case? Since Troy took over. Did it work differently before? 5 o'clock briefing. Everyone present." She said it without editorializing. What would it take to change it back? She looked at him with the expression of someone who has asked exactly this question internally and arrived at an answer that had nowhere to go. "A conversation with Troy," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "It would." He drove home that evening thinking about Carla, about the specific quality of a person who could see problems clearly and didn't have the authority to address them, and about what happened to people like that over time. Either they found the authority or they left, and either outcome represented a cost to whatever operation they were part of. He thought about what an operations director actually was, not in the abstract, not in the job description language, but in practice, a person who created the conditions for people like Carla to function, who had the conversations that floor managers avoided, who caught the patterns that were invisible to anyone who was only looking at one property at a time. He thought he could do it. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, without the specific learning curve of someone who was entering a context they had adjacent knowledge of, but not direct experience in. But he could do the actual work of it, the part that mattered, the part that required the kind of attention and judgment and willingness to say the true thing that had been his whole professional practice for 6 years in a different context. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, his phone rang. "Voss." "I've talked to Linda," Voss said, "and to the team. I've looked at the feedback from the Elm Street visit." A pause. "I want to make you an offer." Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table. The same chair. The kitchen light was on, and the backyard was dark through the window, and Gerald was a shape in the corner of the yard. He said, "I'm listening. It won't start the way you're used to. You'll come in as an associate operations director. For the first 6 months, lower title. Full access, training budget for the areas you've identified as gaps. At 6 months, we evaluate. If it's working, the title and the compensation change." A pause. "It's not the fast version." "I know. The fast version would be less honest. I understand the difference." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Linda thinks you're right for it. Sam thinks you're right for it." The Elm Street visit confirmed what I saw at the Belmont. which is that you read situations accurately and you don't waste the read on your ego. Another pause. Those are harder to teach than contracts and budgets. Mr. Voss, Caleb said. Yes, the Elm Street floor manager. A beat. I know about that situation, Voss said carefully. I want to have that conversation, not someone else. Silence. That's an unusual thing to ask for going in, Voss said. But if I'm going to do this job, I need to know I'm allowed to do the actual job. The silence stretched to 5 seconds. 6. All right, Voss said. We'll talk about how to approach it. But yes. Then yes, Caleb said. I'll take it. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. He thought about Monday morning, which was when he would need to tell Marcus. He thought about the conversation, what it would actually sound like, what Marcus would say. He thought about David, who was coming up fast, who was going to be good. He thought about Sophie in the car line, every day. About pancakes on Saturday mornings, without the shadow of a shift at the end of them. What the shape of a week might look like when the hours in it were different hours. He pulled out the piece of paper from Sunday night, the list of things he didn't know yet, the gaps he had named honestly before the Monday meeting. He looked at it, contracts, corporate budgets, institutional language. Those were learnable. He had learned harder things. Some trained. He folded the paper, put it in the drawer where he kept things he wanted to remember. Sophie's drawings. An old photograph, the letter from the school saying she had made the advanced reading program. Small evidence of forward motion accumulated. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment, in the quiet house, with the October night outside the window, and his daughter asleep down the hall, and a life that was, as of 20 minutes ago, use a different shape than it had been this morning. Dramatically different. Not the version of different that made for a clean story. Just different. In the specific way of a door that has been opened and not yet walked through, and the front of it sent that you were about to take, and the fact that the floor on the other side was unknown, but the floor under your feet right now was solid, and you had gotten here by keeping your feet under you, and there was no reason that would stop working. He went to bed. He slept in his actual clothes this time, not his work clothes, just the regular ones, and he took off both shoes. And he lay down properly under the actual covers, and he was asleep before 9:53. Down the hall, Sophie's light was off. The Cretaceous coastline waited on her desk, still unfinished, full of creatures that had been enormous and capable and perfectly suited to their world, and had not known that the world was about to change, which was the thing about worlds. They changed whether or not you were ready. And what mattered was not whether you saw it coming, but what you did in the time you had. He told Marcus on Monday morning. He came in early before his shift, which was not something he normally did, and Marcus was in the office doing the thing he always did on Monday mornings, which was reviewing the weekend numbers with the specific expression of a man trying to find the story that's inside the math. He looked up when Caleb knocked on the open door. "You're early," Marcus said. "I need to talk to you." Marcus put the papers down. He'd intervened. He had the expression of someone who already knew the general shape of what was coming and had been quietly preparing for it. He gestured at the chair, across from his desk, the one that guests sat in when they were not quite guests. The one Caleb had sat in twice in 4 years for performance reviews, and once after the incident with the aggressive guest that he had handled badly. Caleb sat down. "I've been offered a position at Voss Capital," he said. "Associate Operations Director for the Hospitality Division. Starting in 3 weeks." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. He picked up the papers he had put down and set them on the corner of the desk in a neat stack, which was a thing he did when he was managing his response to something. 3 weeks, Marcus said. "I wanted to give you the full notice. If you need more time, I can talk to them about the start date." Marcus shook his head. 3 weeks is proper notice. I can't ask for more than that." He paused. "Is this what you want? Not just the better hours? Not just the—" "No," Caleb said. "I think I can do it. I think it's the right fit. And yes, the hours matter because of Sophie. But that's not the whole answer." Marcus looked at him for a long moment with the look of a man who had managed people for 11 years and knew the difference between someone leaving because they were running from something and someone leaving because they were moving toward something. The difference mattered. It changed what you felt when they went. "Okay," Marcus said. He said it with the simple finality of a man who respected the decision and wasn't going to dress his feelings up as something more professional than they were. I'm going to miss you. Not as a number on a chart. Specifically. I know, Caleb said. Same. They sat in the office for another few minutes, talking about transition, who would take his section, how David would be developed into the gap, what the handoff looked like for the private dining clients who specifically requested Caleb and would need to be reintroduced to the remaining staff. It was a practical conversation, and both of them were the kind of people who found the practical conversation easier than the other kind. Yes, he'd intervened, and they worked through it with the efficiency of two people who had spent 4 years developing a working shorthand. When Caleb stood to leave, Marcus said, "The Carrington dinner." Caleb looked at him. "I should have fought harder for you when she made the request." Marcus said it flatly, without self-pity, the way honest people acknowledge things that they got wrong. "I walked the line, and I shouldn't have. I should have held the line. You told her I was the best you had," Caleb said. "And then I moved you when she pushed." He shook his head. "That's not the same thing." Caleb considered this. It was true. It was also 4 years of Marcus Chen having his back in 100 smaller ways, and a single moment when the pressure was particular and the calculation was difficult, and Marcus had made the wrong call. People did that. Managers specifically did that because the calculation for a manager was never just the person it was, the table, the client, the revenue, the review that might appear online, the relationship with ownership. Caleb had spent enough time watching Marcus make those calculations to understand their weight. "Marcus," he said, "if I manage to be half the operations person that you've been as a floor manager, that's a good outcome." Marcus looked up at him. "I mean that," Caleb said. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He looked back at his papers. "Get out of here," he said. "You've got a shift to start." Caleb left the office. He worked his final 3 weeks at the Belmont, with the same quality he had always brought to it, which was the only way he knew how to do anything fully until it was done. He trained David on the private dining clients, not through formal instruction, but through proximity. No, bringing him along on the evenings where the room would test him, letting him watch and then letting him do while Caleb watched. David made mistakes. Caleb told him what they were without making him feel small about them, because small was how you felt before you learned something, not how you were supposed to feel after. He had the Troy conversation at Elm Street 2 weeks before his start date, sitting in on a meeting that Linda Park arranged as a transition task, a way of putting him in the room before his title made it official. Troy was 38, and defensive in the way of people who have been told they're good at something, for long enough to have built their identity around it. Discovering that the thing they've been told doesn't match the evidence was landing hard. He sat across the table from Caleb and Linda with his arms crossed and his jaw set. 4 people left in 6 weeks, Linda said, not unkindly. "We need to understand what happened." Troy said, "People leave. It's a high turnover industry." "Not at that rate," Caleb said, "from a team that was stable before." Troy looked at him. There was the specific hostility of someone who has correctly identified that the problem is being pointed at them and has not yet decided whether to defend or absorb. Caleb said, "I'm not here to make a case against you. I'm here because we need to fix the Elm Street floor, and I can't do that without understanding what broke." He paused. "You've been here 2 years before this role. You know the property better than I do. I need that knowledge." Something shifted fractionally in Troy's posture. "Much. Enough." The conversation took an hour and a half and produced, by the end of it, a version of the truth that Troy had not fully spoken out loud before, that the role had been larger than he'd anticipated, that the leap from senior server to floor manager had a gap in it that his training hadn't bridged, that he had dealt with his uncertainty by tightening control instead of asking for support, that the 4 people who left had all been people who pushed back on that tightening. It was not a comfortable conversation. Caleb didn't try to make it comfortable. He tried to make it honest, which was different. And by the end, Troy looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and was not yet sure whether setting it down was a relief or an exposure. Caleb said, "I'm going to recommend a different structure for your role. More support, clearer delineation of what's yours and what goes up. A development track that addresses what you didn't get when you moved into management." He looked at Troy steadily. "But I need to know you're in. And if I'm not, Troy asked. Aggressively. Genuinely. Then we figure out what role fits you better. There's no version of this where you just stay as you are. Troy was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the Elm Street floor was being set up for the evening, and through the glass, Caleb could see Carla moving through the room with her quiet efficiency, adjusting a table placement, checking a service station. "I'm in," Troy said. It wasn't enthusiastic. It was honest, which was enough to start with. His last shift at the Belmont was on a Friday night, which felt right without being planned that way. The restaurant did what it always did, filled up, ran hard, wound down. He moved through his section with the specific attention of someone who knows they're doing something for the last time and is choosing to do it the same way they always have, because that's the only ending that means anything. The end of the night, the small things accumulated. David handled a difficult table on his own, without pulling Caleb in. The kitchen sent a wrong order to table 6, and Caleb managed the correction before the guest noticed. 2 of the prep cooks he'd worked alongside for years stopped him at the kitchen window on his way through and shook his hand, which was not something prep cooks did unless they meant it. At 10:45, the last table in his section settled their check. He stood in the middle of his section for a moment. He didn't make it dramatic. He just stood there in the noise and warmth of a restaurant on a Friday night and registered it 4 years of this floor, this light, this particular arrangement of tables, and the people who came and went across them. All the evenings that had added up to something without announcing that they were doing so. Then he went to do his breakdown. Marcus was waiting at the service station when Caleb finished. He had a glass of wine, which was something Marcus never did before, close, and a second glass. He held one out. Caleb took it. "To the best floor person I've had in 11 years, Marcus said. Loudly. Just the 2 of them, in the winding down restaurant, with the bar noise from the main floor for softening everything. They drank. They didn't make speeches. Ceased. They finished the wine, and Caleb returned his glass to the station and took off his apron for the last time, and folded it the way he had always folded it, out of habit, and because the habit had earned the right to be completed properly. He clocked out at 11:12. 3 weeks later, he started at Voss Capital. The first month was the month of learning things he didn't know, which was disorienting in the specific way of being very competent in one context and beginning in another. He sat in meetings where the language was sometimes unfamiliar, and he took notes without embarrassment. He asked Linda Park questions that he could have Googled, but that benefited from her specific context. He read contracts with a dictionary open beside his laptop. He made exactly the mistakes a person makes when they are new to a scale of operation rather than to operations itself, which was a distinction Linda had articulated on his 3rd day, and which turned out to be accurate. He also did things correctly that surprised the people around him. He caught a vendor problem in the accounts that had been sitting in plain sight for 6 weeks because no one had connected it to the service complaint pattern at the same property. He developed a pre-service briefing protocol that addressed the Elm Street problem and implemented it across 3 properties within the first 6 weeks, and the effects showed up in the next month's feedback data in a way that Sam described as striking. He got some things wrong. He misjudged a staffing call at the 3rd property that cost them 2 weeks of disruption to fix. He moved too fast on a decision about a vendor contract, and Linda had to pull him back, not unkindly, and explain the part of the process he had skipped. He handled it the way he handled things that went wrong, by understanding exactly what he had missed, saying so plainly, and not repeating it. The 6-month review happened in April in the same small conference room where Voss had offered him the conversation. Voss sat across from him. Linda was there. The folder this time was open. "You've had a difficult first 6 months," Voss said. Caleb waited. Difficult in the sense that they were real, Voss clarified. Real learning, real mistakes, real outcomes from both. He looked at the open folder. "The briefing protocol is running at 4 properties now. The vendor issue you caught saved us approximately $40,000 in overcharges we wouldn't have found until the annual audit." He paused. "The staffing call at Hamilton Street cost us 2 weeks and some goodwill with the team there," Caleb said. "Tell me what you'd do differently." Caleb told him. He was specific and he didn't soften it. Voss listened, looked at Linda. Linda said, "He talked to the Hamilton Street team about it directly, without being asked. The manager there actually told me it was the first time she'd seen a director come back and own a call that didn't land. She paused. She asked if that was his habit. Is it, Voss asked Caleb. It's the only thing that makes sense sent to me, Caleb said. If I make a bad call and don't account for it, I lose the information about what made it bad. And I lose the trust of the people who saw it. Voss closed the folder. Operations Director, he said. Full title, full scope, full compensation adjustment retroactive to the first of the month. He looked at Caleb's steadily. Yes, he'd intervened. You earned it in the 3 months. I made you wait 6 because that's what I told you I'd do, and I don't change the terms of agreements. Caleb said, I wouldn't have wanted you to. He drove home that evening through the April version of Westbridge, which was the best version trees working themselves back into green, the particular quality of evening light in spring that made everything look slightly more considered than it actually was. He picked Sophie up from school. She was in the middle of telling Emma something when she saw the car, and she paused her story mid-sentence with the efficiency of a person who would return to it later, climbed in, and said, How was your day? Good, he said. Really good. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. Review? Yeah. And Operations Director. Full title. Sophie's expression went through several stages rapidly. Comprehension, then the specific satisfaction of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. I said you'd get it, she said. You said I'd be good at it. You didn't say anything about the timeline. The timeline was obvious, she said, with the serenity of a person who had never doubted this. He laughed, which was a real laugh, the kind that came without being summoned. So Sophie looked pleased with herself and returned to looking out the window, and he drove through the April evening, feeling the particular quality of a thing that has been worked for over time, and has arrived not in a dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small decisions made correctly over many months. He thought about the Belmont and the private dining room and a Friday night in October. He thought about Richard Voss setting a business card on a cleared table. He thought about sitting in the staff room in his work clothes, not knowing whether the door was real. He thought about how none of it had been inevitable. At any point, he could have made different calls. He could have read differently to Sloane Carrington's request and created a scene that closed doors instead of opening them. He could have not called Voss on Saturday morning. He could have talked himself out of Monday's meeting with the careful logic of a person who has trained himself to be realistic about what people like him get offered. He hadn't, though, not because he was fearless, because Diane had told him to call and he had listened, because he had a daughter who told him he'd be good at whatever it was, because 4 years of doing the right thing in small moments had built a posture toward the world that defaulted to forward motion rather than retreat. Those were the only reasons. They were enough. In late April, Sloane Carrington came back to the Belmont. Didn't know she was there until he got a text from Marcus. Your friend Carrington is here. Thought you should know. He wasn't working, it was a Thursday evening, and he no longer worked Friday nights at the Belmont. Had not for 4 months. He was at home making dinner, while Sophie explained, at length, a conflict in her social ecosystem that involved Emma and a third party named Priya, and a disagreement about a group project that had the complexity of something requiring a mediator. He texted Marcus back, how's she doing? Marcus replied after a few minutes, alone. Assistance. Looks different than October. Caleb thought about that for a moment. He thought about what she had texted him in October. I'm changing something at my company. It's going to make some people uncomfortable. He had heard through the specific current of Westbridge business conversation that Voss's office carried, that Carrington Technologies had revised its hiring and promotion protocols significantly, that several mid-level employees who had been passed over for years had been elevated into roles they were qualified for, that the revision had not been universally popular with the people who had benefited from the previous system, that Sloane Carrington had not reversed course when it got uncomfortable. He hadn't texted her back about any of that. It wasn't his to comment on. She was doing what she said she'd do. That was between her and the decision she had made in an empty restaurant in October. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to dinner. Sophie's social conflict was resolved, apparently during the time it took to eat, because by the end of the meal she had moved on to a new topic entirely, the Cretaceous coastline drawing, which she had finally, after 4 months, declared finished. You can see it after dinner, she said. He had been waiting 4 months for this. After the dishes were in the sink, she led him down the hall to her room and stood next to her desk with the expression of someone presenting work they are prepared to defend. No. The drawing was large. She had taped 3 pieces of paper together to get the width she wanted and covered in the dense, careful detail of someone who had spent 4 months looking at reference material and taking it seriously. There was a coastline in the distance, rendered in the specific blue-green that she had mixed herself. There were creatures in the water, a mosasaur below the surface, a smaller thing near the rocks, something with a long neck that he thought might be a plesiosaur. On the shore, there were plants she had researched, rendered with botanical specificity that was slightly out of proportion in the charming way of a child who is more interested in accuracy than perspective. In the bottom corner, in her handwriting, it said, Cretaceous Coast, 75 million years ago. Drawn by Sophie Mercer, age 8. He looked at it for a long time. She said, Sophie, he said, this is serious work. She tried not to look too pleased. I know, she said. I looked everything up. I can tell. He pointed at the long-necked creature near the rocks. Is that a plesiosaur? Elasmosaurus, she said, with the tolerant correction of an expert. They're different. Elasmosaurus had a much longer neck. She pointed to indicate the specific length. Thought I could just draw any long neck thing, but that would be wrong. Emma would be wrong about that, he agreed. I told her. She looked at the drawing with him, the two of them standing side by side in her small room. Do you think it's what it was really like? He thought about how to answer this. I think, he said, that you looked at everything you could find, and you thought about it carefully, and you made the most accurate picture you could make with the information you had. He paused. That's what scientists do. That's what anyone does who takes something seriously. Sophie was quiet for a second. It's not perfect, she said. The watercolor is a little off. I couldn't get the exact green. It's close. Close isn't the same as right. He looked at her. 8 years old. Standing next to a drawing she had spent 4 months on, finding the specific place where it fell short, he said. Close isn't the same as right. But it means you were trying for the right thing. And next time you'll get closer. He looked at the drawing again. This is really good, Sophie. She let the pleased look happen this time. Just briefly. I'm going to start another one, she said. Of the Cambrian explosion. There were a lot of weird animals. There were, he agreed. He went back to the kitchen, made his coffee, sat at the table. His phone had a notification, a message from Linda about a property visit Thursday. Reminder from Sophie's school about a parent meeting next week, which he would attend, in person, in the afternoon, without rearranging a shift to do it. A text from Diane asking nothing in particular, just checking in, the way she did. He thought about Sloane Carrington sitting alone at the Belmont. He thought about what it took to walk back into the room where you had been at your worst. He thought about how that was its own kind of work, not the work of building something, but the harder work of changing the thing that needed changing, which was how you saw people. And you couldn't do it from the outside. You had to do it from the inside. And it was slow and imperfect, and the people you had affected didn't always get to see it happen. He picked up his phone. He texted Marcus, "How's David doing?" with the private dining section. Marcus replied after a minute, "Better than I expected." He remembered 3 dietary restrictions without checking the notes tonight. Caleb smiled. He put the phone down. He thought about the things that don't announce themselves when they're happening the evening at a restaurant in October that didn't feel like a beginning. The phone call on a Saturday morning that didn't feel like courage. The months of work that didn't feel like becoming something until you turned around and saw how far back the start was. He thought about the old idea that people revealed themselves under pressure. He had always thought that was only half true. Pressure revealed something. Yes. What you did after the pressure, when no one was watching and there was no audience for the better version of yourself, that was the other half. Was the part you had to keep working on after the room emptied out. A text came in from an unknown number. He opened it. "This is Sloane. I'm at the Belmont. I know you're not working here anymore. Marcus told me when I asked for you. I'm not sure why I came except that I wanted to be in the place where I started trying to be better at this." That sounds strange written out. He read it twice. He typed, "It doesn't sound strange." She replied, "Marcus gave me David tonight. He's very good. He is. He remembered that I don't like the first breadbasket. He brought me the second one without me asking. Caleb looked at that message. He thought about training David, about standing beside him during evenings that tested him and telling him what he saw, accurately and without diminishing him. About the moment 3 weeks before his last shift when David had handled a difficult table alone and done it well. And the look on his face after, which was the look of someone who had just found out what they were capable of. He wrote back. I showed him that. A pause. Sloan wrote, "You trained someone in the same thing that changed my whole evening in October. Do you understand how significant that is?" He thought about it. About Marcus, who had trained him. About whoever had trained Marcus. Yes, intervened. About the long, invisible chain of people showing other people how to do the right thing in the small moments, and those people going out into the world and doing it, and occasionally, not always, not predictably, but occasionally those small things accumulating into something larger than anyone planned. I think it's just how things work when they work right. She sent back, "I'm going to tell you something." He waited. The partnership closed in December. Harrington Voss Park, all of them. The deal was everything I'd been working toward for 2 years. Congratulations. I haven't told anyone this next part. A pause. The morning before the contracts were signed, I sat in my office for about an hour, not thinking about the deal. I was thinking about the Elm Street property and whether I'd been the kind of person there who I wanted to be. Whether the decision I'd made about how to value people was actually in how I operated every day or just in the new policy document. What did you decide? That the policy document is the easy part. The harder part is every room you walk into after. He sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote, "Yeah, that's the whole thing, actually." He put his phone on the table. Outside the kitchen window, Gerald was coming back. The tree had been bare for months and was now in April doing the slow returning thing that bare trees did, the particular green of leaves that were still deciding how big to get. The lawn needed work again. The fence still needed repainting. There were things in the backyard that were always going to need doing, and he was going to keep doing them. In the same way, he kept doing everything not because it was always easy, or because the result's always right, but because it was the work, and the work was what you had. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, which meant she had decided on her own to start getting ready for bed, which was new. He looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You're getting ready for bed." "I'm tired." "Okay." She stood in the doorway for a second. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Do you think the Elasmosaurus knew it was going to be extinct?" He considered this seriously, because Sophie's questions deserved serious consideration. He said, "I think it just lived the way it lived, as well as it could." Sophie thought about that. "That's kind of sad." "Or kind of good," he said, "depending on how you look at it." She seemed to be weighing both options. "I think it's both," she said finally, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had found the accurate answer and was comfortable with it being complicated. Caleb said, "I think so too." She went down the hall. He heard the bathroom, the faucet, the specific sound of the nightly routine. Her room door. He turned the kitchen light off. He went to the window and looked out at the backyard at Gerald coming back, at the fence that needed painting, at the rectangle of grass that was just grass, not a view, not a landscape. Just the backyard of a rented house in Westbridge, where a 32-year-old man had raked in October and stood at the window thinking about a business card and a door. He thought about everything that had come from that one evening at the Belmont, in the way of someone who saw it as destiny or design, in the way of someone who understood that the evening had not created any of it. The evening had only made visible what was already there, the judgment Voss had recognized, the integrity Sloan had needed to see, the capacity that had been built across years of doing the work correctly in rooms where no one was watching for it. The world did not always reward those things. He was old enough to know that. Were plenty of versions of that October evening, where Voss does not leave a card, where Harrington does not close a folder, where the dinner ends without consequence, and Caleb drives home with a stiff neck and picks up Sophie and makes pancakes on Saturday and keeps working the floor for another year and another year after that, was a real possibility. It had been the most probable possibility going into that evening. What made the difference was not luck exactly, though luck was part of it. What made the difference was that when the moment arrived, when Voss put the card on the table, when Diane said to call, when the door showed itself, Caleb had been ready to walk through it. Ready because of years of building the thing you needed to be built before the moment came. You couldn't do the work after. The work had to be done before. And the work was quiet and daily and unrewarded for a long time. And most of it happened in empty rooms and late nights and small decisions that nobody noticed. Was the whole of it. There was nothing more complicated than that. He went to bed. In her room, Sophie was already asleep, with the Cretaceous cone pincers above her desk, where she could see it from her pillow. 4 months of careful work, accurate to the edge of what an 8-year-old could make, accurate, signed in the corner in her own name. The mosasaur in the deep water, the elasmosaurus near the rocks, the ancient coastline rendered in imperfect, earnest detail by a child who cared about getting it right. Outside, the April night was cool and clear. The streetlights made their usual shapes on the ceiling. And in a house on an ordinary street in Westbridge, a single father slept well. The way people sleep when they have done the day's work honestly, and tomorrow is a day they are not afraid of. The person they are trying to be and the person they actually are have gotten close enough to the same thing that the distance between them, for now, is livable, is not a perfect ending, but it is a true one. And true, for most people who have tried to earn it, is the better thing.